All right, seeing as it's 6 o'clock, I'll check on channel 8. Is everything good there, staff? Going to call to order the May 25th, 2021 study session of the Boulder City Council, and we will start with a couple of announcements. First announcement, COVID-19 vaccines. For local information on getting your vaccine and sign up for notifications, go to boco.org/COVID vaccine notify sign up. And let that sit up there for just a couple seconds so everyone can see it. And the second announcement for boards and commissions, you still have time to apply to serve on one of the city's boards or following: Boulder Junction Access District Parking and Boulder Junction Access District Travel Demand Management, and the Beverage Licensing Authority. Anyone interested in applying, please visit our boards and commissions webpage at bouldercolorado.gov/boards-commissions. And please do sign up before our next round of board and commission recruiting. And with that, we will move on to our regular agenda. And the first item is going to be municipal funding options.
That will be presented by Kara Skinner. So I invite her and her team to join in and present.
Great, thank you, Nuria, and thank you, Adam and council members. Kara Skinner, Assistant Director of Finance. And I think someone should be bringing the presentation up. Thank you. So I will be doing the presentation tonight, but I do also have with me Cheryl Patali, our Chief Financial Officer, and Devin Billingsley, our Senior Budget Manager, who can also assist me with questions as we go along. Next slide. So the agenda for tonight, and I will try to stick with Bob's goal of getting out in daylight, is to go over what are our current local funding sources at the City of Boulder, what are some important funding options or funding option considerations when weighing different funding options, what are those additional local funding options available to you as a board in the community, and also just to keep on the table what have been the current city and county additional funding source discussions that have been happening through late last year and into this year, and in some instances have been on the table for a little while because of COVID. Next slide. So this slide, first we wanted to summarize and acknowledge what are the city's current local funding sources, and we've put it into these sort of 6 buckets. And we are focusing on local. We acknowledge that the city does get funding from the state and the federal government, but these are the funding sources that are under city council control, and in some of these instances need voter approval. So starting with the property tax, that is based on assessed valuation of both real property and some people forget that it's also on business personal property. And then there's the sales tax, which is the retail sales tax and its companion use taxes, which are charged or paid by local businesses or residents when they make purchases outside the city and don't pay sales tax on it when they pay for it outside the city. They then owe a use tax to the city. And that's a companion to the sales tax to try to avoid the incentive of that would otherwise be in place for businesses, particularly to purchase items outside the city. Then the City of Boulder does have a number of selective sales taxes on marijuana, food service, as well as electronic smoking devices. The city also has a number of occupation taxes, or they're known as occupational privilege taxes. They are taxes for the privilege of operating a business or a trade within a jurisdiction. We also have quite a few excise taxes in place on a number of different activities or goods or products, and I won't go through the whole list there. We'll talk about some on some subsequent slides. And then, of course, we have a number of fees, charges, and fines that are put in place. So those are sort of the big picture. The city has essentially afforded itself a lot of the tools that are available to local governments in the state of Colorado. When we embarked on this project, we did look at the Colorado Municipal League maintains a database of all of the tax measures that have been on the ballot since Tabor was passed in 1992. And so that database, you know, there have been more than 1,000, actually more than 1,100 tax measures that have been on the ballot across the state in that period of time. And so we did sort of look at that and see what passed, what other cities and towns have in place. And there are not a substantial number that are in place that the city of Boulder does not already have in place. Next slide. Speaking of Tabor, we do want to just acknowledge as we consider funding options that there are restrictions due to Tabor. As you all know, voter approval is required for new taxes, tax increases, and tax extensions. Tabor also prohibits local governments from implementing a local income tax. And then as of the date of Tabor, there can be no new real estate transfer taxes. If a jurisdiction had one in place when Tabor was passed, they were able to maintain that tax, but no new real estate transfer taxes. So next slide. So one of the things we heard from council was just to put forward sort of advantages and disadvantages of various funding options. And so these are sort of the things that we gathered to consider as a body or a community is considering funding options. And they come from best practices or just important facts that are the result of different taxes or fees. And so we'll go through these quickly, and then we'll be sort of going over some advantages and disadvantages of the different funding options with these in mind. So the first is flexible. And as you know, the Blue Ribbon Commission and best practices do recommend that revenue sources should not be restricted, but rather should be flexible to give the governing body the ability to prioritize spending needs, especially as they evolve. However, it is known, particularly in states that have a Tabor in place, that to garner taxpayer support, often it is common that tax proposals are set forth for a dedicated purpose. So it is and has been very common across the state of Colorado. Next, it is best practices for there to be ongoing funding sources for ongoing needs. Next, revenue generating capacity. Some funding options have the ability to generate more revenue, and that's something to consider in terms of need. What is the business impact? A higher tax rate can negatively impact local businesses. It could make them less competitive in a region. Particularly with higher property taxes, businesses may need to pass along those higher taxes in the price of their goods or services, something to be considered. And then also with higher sales taxes, consumers may choose to shop outside the jurisdiction. Next, regressive, neutral, and progressive, and I think council has talked about this a bit. You know, of course, a regressive tax is one that lower income taxpayers would pay a greater percentage of their income on the tax than a higher income taxpayer would. And a neutral tax is one that is generally about the same proportion. Most of the funding options available to local government are relatively regressive or neutral. It is difficult to put in place a progressive tax. What is the total taxpayer burden? This is something to consider, particularly with property tax and sales tax. We'll talk about that later, but the city is not the only taxing jurisdiction with respect to those. So while it's important what the city's tax rates are, it's also important to consider what is the total tax rate. What are the underlying economic drivers? And we listed some of these in the memo, but basically different communities have different mixes. They have a different mix of properties, residential, commercial, nonprofit, which are then tax exempt, visitor destination versus an employment center. What's the mix of primary service or retail jobs? Those are things to sort of acknowledge and what the impact would be on the funding source. And then last, this COVID-19 recovery is something that, of course, is just a time sensitive issue. And that is, we all recognize that COVID-19 has severely impacted many of our businesses in the community, and as well as our community members. And so there's some considerations to be made with regard to that at this particular time. Next slide. So with those considerations in mind, here's a high-level look of additional financing options by category. And we will review these more in detail on the following slides, as well as present some data for each. And then, as I noted earlier, some advantages and disadvantages for each. So for each of these funding options, we have noted that you can either increase rates or implement new taxes or fees or fines. For property taxes, there's the additional option of forming a special district, and then that special district would implement a property tax. And that's what we have been talking about with regard to the library and the potential for a library district. For sales tax, there is the option to broaden the tax base to include more services. And we do have some slides about that later also. For excise taxes, and I mentioned this earlier, there aren't many that are in place across the state that the city of Boulder does not already have. The few that we did see that could be relevant to the city of Boulder are rental car storage facilities or mini storage facilities, and then hemp. Some of the communities across the state that have gaming have some gaming excise taxes, but that is not the case in Boulder. And then with regard to fees, charges, and fines, we just do want to highlight that the conversation had begun to possibly consider a transportation maintenance fee or transportation utility fee back in 2019 in conjunction with transportation master plan. That was last presented to council in June of 2019. And then I think that conversation was delayed by COVID. Next slide. Oh, we have a little, we have a pie chart that went awry. I apologize for that. So this is just the facts about property tax, and I can tell you what the numbers are behind that part that somehow moved. But the current total city mill levy is 11.981, or just under 12 mills. And that is anticipated to generate in 2021, $48 million. What the pie chart on the right was intended to show was the blue piece of the pie is the general fund, general purpose portion of the city's total mill levy. And that amount is 7.948 mills, or just under 8 mills. And then the yellow portion of the pie is the general fund also, but dedicated to public safety, and that's 2 mills. And then the gray piece of the pie is permanent parks, and that's 0.9 mills. So what we just wanted to again remind council and the community is we do have a general fund mill levy, but then we also have these dedicated mill levies to permanent parks, library, and then also CHAP, which is Community Housing Assistance Program for affordable housing. So I apologize for that. I just want to also note that 1 mill increase would generate approximately $4.3 million. That's based upon our expectations for 2022 revenue. And if the city were to increase its property tax for every 1 mill increase on a $1 million market value home, the impact would be about $72 per year. So we just we picked a higher value than we had in our conversations with the library district, but decided to pick sort of a round number of $1 million, and people can do the math up and down around that if needed. Just want to also remind, we could increase, the city could increase the mill rate with voter approval by just over 1 mil before hitting the charter cap of 13 mils. And again, any change would require voter approval. And then just also wanted to acknowledge that the city does have a few special districts in place, Caged in the downtown core, University Hill, Boulder Junction, and then Forest Glen. And those special districts have mill levies that are applicable just for their district boundaries, and they generate approximately $2.4 million in total. Next slide. So how does the city compare to other Front Range cities? And I apologize, this slide has a lot. We've shown this slide, I think, numerous times to council, but we'll try to walk through it. The slide compares the cities or the mill levies within the cities that are named here. And there's 9 Front Range cities here. And they're in order of the total mill levy, and with going from left to right to the lowest to the highest. So Westminster, the city of Westminster, and the portion of the city that is in Jefferson County has the lowest total mill levy of just over 76 mills. And amongst these cities, Longmont has the highest at 97, or just over 97. You'll see the city of Boulder is third to the bottom there with a total mill levy of 87.045. So clearly, there are multiple taxing jurisdictions within each of these cities that can levy a mill or a property tax. And I guess I would just draw your attention to that bottom blue portion of the stack, and that is each city's general fund mill levy. So so you can see that it varies quite substantially across the cities how much their general fund mill levy is. And then above that navy blue general fund mill levy for each city are the varieties of colors. And these are mill levies that are put in place for what we consider traditional municipal services. And those are mill levies that are either dedicated mill levies by the city, or they may be a special district that's providing that service that we would consider a traditional municipal service. So if you look at all of those varieties of colors in total, that's sort of the total mill levy each city has dedicated to what we would consider traditional municipal services. On top of those varieties of colors is the blue, which is the biggest, which of course is the school district. The school districts in nearly every community has the largest mill levy. And then stacked on top of that, at the top in that bright pink, is the county's mill levy. So, so Boulder in total is toward the bottom. Boulder is also toward the bottom in terms of the total of those municipals. And I apologize that, you know, they're not lined up the same way the total is. But I think only one city has a municipal mill levy total less than the city. I made a note of that. The other thing I thought I'd just mention here, just to give people a feel for what does this translate to in terms of dollars. So again, we'll take $1 million home. On $1 million home in Westminster, the property tax bill would be just under $5,500 a year. And then the highest, which is Longmont, on $1 million home would be just under $7,000 a year. So at the low end of the spectrum, it's 5,500. At the high end of the spectrum, it's 7,000 on $1 million property. So this just gives you a feel of sort of where Boulder is relative to its neighbors. Looking at this, one might also think there's sort of this perceived, you know, all of these communities are under 100 mils. So is there some sort of perceived ceiling at 100 mils? You know, I don't know, but that is just something to note. I will also note that in many of these communities, particularly the ones that are east and south, there are in many instances special districts that lay on top of these that would have even higher mill levies if there would be some special metropolitan districts and such. But this is how we compare across many of our peer cities. Next slide. So a property tax. Thinking about those things we mentioned earlier of considerations. What are advantages of property tax? There is a nexus because municipal services do benefit property owners. Historically, in the city of Boulder and in Boulder County, the real estate market has been stable and growing. There's no bullet for this, but related to that, because of the lag in the assessed valuation process, property tax revenue is often stable through the most severe early parts of a recession. It sort of hits at a different time. It hits much later, maybe 2.5 years later. Administration is through the county. It's very efficient, established process. It is a less regressive, more neutral tax. Disadvantages, this first bullet is probably one of the greater concerns, in that the property tax really is a tax on unrealized capital gains. That is, many residents that have owned their property for a long period of time while the value of their property goes up and therefore the property tax bill goes up, they may not be in a position where their cash position is improving. So while their income may not be growing, and in fact may be declining if they're moving into retirement years, their property tax bill continues to grow. It's not as transparent. The value of the property needs to be estimated. There's not an actual transaction upon which to do the value. And then for some, the fact that it is large lump sum payments may be a burden. If there's no mortgage on the property requiring escrow, they have to do some budgeting and planning to make sure that they can make those large payments. Next slide. So sales and use tax, the city's total rate for 2021 is 3.86%. And the breakdown of that is to the right in that pie. Luckily, it worked. You'll see that we did put the percentages here in terms of percent of the total, mostly to note that for our sales and use taxes, less than half is for general purposes, only 46%. So 54% is dedicated. In 2021, the budget is for $130 million total sales and use tax revenue. Looking forward with our revised 2021 forecast that we've gotten from CU, 0.1% is anticipated to generate about $3.7 million. Change, of course, does require voter approval. Next slide. So this shows the city's sales and use tax rates looking out into the future. We do have a number of term limited sales and use taxes. This also shows the breakdown between the dedication, as did the pie on the previous slide. But what's important to note here is that there are a number of taxes expiring in the next 15 years. As is noted, the community culture and safety tax expires at the end of this year, and Cheryl will be speaking about that in the next agenda item tonight. That's a 0.3% tax. At the end of 2024, a 0.15% general fund tax expires. So you'll see in that third bar over, in the years from 2025 to 2029, The general fund tax rate is actually 0.15% less than it has been, which represents about $5.6 million. So that will be a hit to the general fund for those 5 years if that 0.15% tax is not renewed. It does jump back up in 2020 or 2030. And then there's expiring taxes for open space and parks in subsequent years. So those are things we'll have to keep an eye on and plan for. Next slide. So this is another crazy slide similar to the property tax slide. Again, comparing to the communities across the Front Range for sales and use tax rates. And again, we have the same sort of scheme where at the bottom across all of the bars is the city's general fund sales and use tax rates. And then if you sort of look to the middle of the bars, that's the state, the 2.9% in gray. And then above that are the regional taxes for RTD, and then the scientific and cultural facilities district, and then the county. So those sort of state and regional ones begin with the gray and toward the top. And then what we consider sort of municipal starts with that navy blue on the bottom, and then those variety of colors. So the takeaway here is for sales and use tax, total tax rate, Boulder is actually at the highest end across these pure cities at 8.845%. Boulder is actually one of the lowest, or not quite the lowest, but second to the lowest in terms of general fund sales tax rate. The only city with a lower general fund sales tax rate is Longmont. The other thing to note is Boulder, Longmont, and Fort Collins have the most dedicated, like those three have chosen to implement many more specific dedicated sales taxes than the other communities. So across these cities, we are toward the high end in terms of our total sales tax rate for municipal services by whatever model that's provided, and the top total sales and use tax rate. We have noted, I think, in previous presentations that in the state of Colorado, we don't see total sales tax rate creeping above 10% really much, except there may be a couple mountain towns that have a tax rate above 10%. So again, here there seems to be sort of this perceived maximum somewhere around the 9-ish% level. Next slide. So the one thing that we noted on the earlier slide was that one other option with regard to sales and use tax besides increasing the rate is to broaden the tax base. And what we mean by that is typically mostly what is taxed are goods. There are some enumerated services that are subject to the sales tax, but for the most part, what is taxable are goods. And this has been a concern across the country for years and has been discussed across the state as well. And this chart we found in a Tax Foundation fiscal fact note or study that shows how over time, the mix of how people spend their personal income essentially has shifted from buying more goods to more services. From late in the 1950 or around 1950, it was more than 60% of what they spent was on goods, to now in the 2000s, it's in the approximately 35%. So more of what people are spending their money on is not taxable, which is eroding tax revenues for both states and local governments. So considering broadening the base to include more services, that would require voter approval. But it's something that some states have done and something that could be considered. We don't have a very good estimate of the revenue that it could generate. It really would depend upon what services were included. states that have broadened their base have seen a 1%, 2%, 5% increase, depending on how and what they did. Looking at our data in our sales tax system, we think at a minimum it would be $1 million, but it would in all likelihood be more than that. But just wanted to share this with you. Next slide. So sales and use tax advantages can be a productive and is a very productive source of revenue. It generally grows with inflation as the price of the products grows, tax revenue grows. It's a diverse taxpayer base, both residents, businesses, commuters, and visitors all contribute. And then again, though, there is a little bit of concern with the shift from goods to services, and then there's the shifting demographics or consumer mix or business mix could be an advantage. It actually could be a disadvantage, depends what the shift is. And then disadvantages, of course, we know not only can it react quickly to economic shocks like a pandemic, it also does typically react quickly to just more traditional economic cycles. It is regressive, and there is concern about regional competitiveness, cross-border effects. Next slide. So occupational privilege taxes, those are imposed on the privilege of operating a business or practicing an occupation. And the ones that are in place for the city are listed in that table with the rates and the 2021 budget for the revenue for each of them. The ones that the city has in place thus far are specific to an occupation or a trade. There is the potential to put in place a general occupational privilege tax that's known as a head tax. And a head tax could be levied on an employee or an employer or both. And council did explore a head tax back in 2016, early 2017, which culminated with a council memo and no further direction to go forward, but it has been looked at somewhat recently. It, of course, does require voter approval. Next slide. These are the cities across the Front Range that do have that head tax in place. And in each instance, they do charge it on both the employee and the employer. And the rates vary from $2 per month to $5, or in the case of Denver, it's $5.75 for the employee. Next slide. So advantages and disadvantages. It can, depending upon how broadly it is applied and the rate, generate substantial revenue. It's usually predictable and stable. It does address concern that in-commuting employees do have an impact on the community and municipal services. It would be locally collected. Disadvantages is it may have a negative impact on businesses or influence them to choose not to locate here. There has definitely been concern about the impact on small businesses and nonprofits, and it does not necessarily grow with inflation. Probably doesn't have a very close tie to inflation. And just want to reiterate that when this was looked at back in 2017, there were concerns by employers about the impact on small businesses and nonprofits, and employee retention and the cost of doing business. And all of those are definitely concerns by a number of our businesses, particularly right now following COVID. Next slide. So excise taxes, these are the list of excise taxes that are in place. There are varying rates. They are in order of the revenue that is anticipated to be generated by them. You'll note accommodations tax at the top there at 5.3 million. In 2020, only 3.3 million was generated. It was severely impacted by COVID. And before COVID, it was over 8 million. So we anticipated some bounce back from 2020, but still nowhere near where we were pre-COVID. Also, sugar sweetened beverage distribution tax. We have actually been budgeting that at 3.8 million since its inception. And it actually came in right at 3.8 million last year. But before COVID, it actually did generate about 5 million. But with so many activity or events being canceled, I think that revenue was down significantly in 2020. Next slide. So advantages of an excise tax is that they're definitely put in place to achieve some policy goal typically, and the revenue that they generate can be used to offset the impact of whatever the activity or the good and service is. They are transparent, people can see them. Typically they're transparent, they can be on the distributor and not reflected on a receipt. So they're not always transparent, but many of them are, like the accommodations tax and the admissions tax. Disadvantages, they can negatively impact businesses and they may be regressive depending upon what is being taxed and the composition of the people that, or the demographics of the people purchasing it. Next slide. So for fees, charges, and fines, you know, the fees and charges are imposed specifically to defray the cost of some particular service, that there needs to be nexus and a costs of service study completed. Fines are put in place really to deter actions and in some instances compensate for costs of enforcement. Implementation of these do not require a vote. We again have listed here some of our bigger fee, charge, and fine categories in terms of the revenue that they generate, and they're listed in that order. Affordable housing, cash in lieu, that bounces around a lot. They budget a conservative number and then it gets adjusted through the adjustment to base. So that's what their current estimate is. And then the very last line there, I'll note affordable housing linkage fees. Those, they also do budget super conservatively, and then they typically adjust through ATB. So the amount generated through linkage fees may be well more than 525,000. But as you can see, this has been a trend across local governments to the extent that there is a rational nexus to put user fees and charges in place, and it is a significant source of revenue. Next slide. So advantages and disadvantages, it sends a price signal. The thing that is important here is if there are services that do not have a charge or a fee associated with it, then it could lead to overuse or a waste. So it's nice to have that price signal in place. It can be adjusted easily since it does not require voter approval. Of course, disadvantages, not everything can be financed through a user fee. Depending upon the fee and the service, it may limit lower income residents from accessing services. Oftentimes compensating programs are put in place for that. There could be scholarship type programs. May cause business flight or disincentive to businesses, and determining that full cost, you know, it's a rigorous cost of service study that often needs to be completed. Next slide. So we also just wanted to highlight, when we did that review of the CML database, we heard a lot of interest from a number of council members with regard to specific funding sources for different types of social services. We heard affordable housing, homeless, mental health, behavioral health. These were the taxes that we found that have been approved across the state for these types of services. So we just wanted to capture that in one table for council's purposes. So you'll see that there are a variety there. And we did just note that Denver, we have an asterisk by that because, as you all know, it is a city and county. And so sort of the breadth of services they provide is often different than for just a local government. And next slide. And here's where we wanted to again capture the discussions that are being had. Of course, last week there was a discussion regarding a library district, the potential for a library district, and what has been talked about has been possibly a 3.85 mils if approved by voters, which might generate around $20 million per year. The city has the expiring community culture and safety tax. So discussions about extending that, which will be in, again, tonight's second agenda item. Boulder County, we've heard discussion, but I don't think from people that we've talked to that the county has landed on what they're maybe thinking when and what and how much. But the issues or the dedicated purposes that are they're considering, we have heard, are mental behavioral health services and infrastructure, possibly affordable housing, and possibly transportation. And then again, just wanted to capture this conversation that had begun before COVID with regard to the city and the potential for a transportation utility fee or maintenance fee. And next slide. And this is then the questions for council. If you have any questions regarding these funding options, and if you would like council or like staff to develop a work plan to explore any specific options. With that, I will open it up.
Thank you, Cara. We're going to start with questions, so line up, and then we'll do a round of input. So I have Bob, Sam, and Mary. Bob?
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Cara. Just one question. Several years ago, Bob Icahn, who was Cheryl's predecessor as the CFO, estimated that about 40 to 50% of the sales tax that was paid in Boulder, that was collected by the city of Boulder, was paid by people who were non-residents. I think it was kind of a back of the envelope estimate, so I'm not sure that Bob did that scientifically. Have you guys since then done any scientific study, or could you do a scientific study if you haven't, just to get a little bit more precision around that?
We have not. That is something we could discuss. I know there have been different methodologies that different communities have used. I don't know if we can dig up Bob's methodology, but we could definitely look at that.
That's probably on the back of an envelope, literally. But if it's not too much work, I think it would be great to know that, not only just to know it, because obviously we were hit by that pretty significantly during COVID, because we had a lot of visitors who simply weren't coming to our town either from surrounding communities or from out of town. So I think it's a good data to have for the next crisis when tourists stop coming. And then second, I think it'll be interesting information when it comes to the community discussion around the infrastructure tax. So for example, I'll just throw some numbers out. If there's 46,000 households in Boulder and the infrastructure tax creates about $10 million a year, you could say, well, that costs the average household, if tax was paid only by, sales tax was paid only by households, that'd be about $200 a year. But obviously if half our tax is paid by people that don't live here, then that's probably more than like $100 a year. People might like to know that information. You know, how much is it going to cost me? Because no one probably goes back and pulls all the receipts and tries to figure out how much they paid in sales tax. But if we could kind of figure out what an average household in Boulder pays, and we'd have to back out of that what non-households pay for sales tax. So if it's not too much work, that would be great.
Yes.
All right, Sam?
Thanks for the presentation, guys. This was great as always. My question is super trivial. I was curious about the special districts. You mentioned Forest Glen. I cannot remember anything about a Forest Glen special district. What is that?
It's a district that has a small mill levy that generates just enough revenue for the people within the district to get eco passes.
Oh, it's an eco-pass district. All right,
Yeah.
Thank you. That was my only question.
Mm-hmm.
Mary, Mark, and then Aaron.
Thank you, Adam. I have two questions. The first one is kind of along the lines of what Bob was asking. I noticed that in the property tax bar graph, Boulder was at the lower end. And then when we looked at the sales and use tax bar graph, Boulder was at the higher end. And so I'm wondering, to what extent is that due to our economic drivers compared to other communities?
That's an interesting question. Boy, we need somebody that has been here a long time and can recall the history. Well, there is the charter mill levy cap. I don't know the history behind the 13 mill cap, but that I think, of course, constrains it to some degree. But it's an interesting prospect if that has been part of council's previous discussions, that a sales and use tax does capture contributions from in-commuters. It does capture contributions from tourists. So, you know, I don't know if the conversations that council has had in the past has been around that to the extent sales tax is put in place instead of a property tax, it is paid by those other groups of people. I don't know, Cheryl, if you want to add, you've been here way longer than I have.
I haven't been here long enough, apparently, because in my 9 years, I don't recall having those kind of conversations, Mary. So, I mean, we can certainly dig back. It might be difficult to find rationale of past councils, but sorry, I can't help with that question.
Okay. No, I was just curious. Oh, sorry, Devin.
Yep, sure. I guess one important is that, you know, we do pay for both fire service and our library through our municipal sales tax, which is not as common across the front range. So I think that for us tends to keep our property taxes a bit under our peers.
Okay. Thank you for that. And then my second question is about the excise tax. And in the memo and also in the presentation, you mentioned that one of the things that we don't have an excise tax on is storage facilities. And so what, if any, communities have put that in place? And what does that kind of excise tax look like? Is it on square footage? Is it on number of units? Is it, how is that assessed?
I don't recall. I could probably dig through my Excel file of the database, but that'd probably take longer than we want, but I can follow up with that answer.
Yeah, I'd be really curious about that. And here's why. Well, I guess I can do that during the discussion. Thank you.
All right, I've got Mark, Aaron, and Rachel, and anyone else who has a question, please line up.
Okay, thanks, Kara. That was a terrific presentation. Just a couple of questions. First is on the total mills for real property taxes. The allocation between the various entities, school district, county, city, who determines that? Is that a county function?
So each taxing jurisdiction certifies their mill levy to the county, but so each taxing jurisdiction sets their mill levy, and they need to have voter approval for it to have any changes to their mill levy. But so yes, it's each jurisdiction.
Okay. Let's talk for just a minute about a head tax. You showed a chart that had other communities that have done this. Do we have any data or information as to what the actual impact has been from those head taxes on their business competitive? Have they experienced a rush of businesses leaving? Has it had either adverse or positive impacts? And I understand the theory that it will make businesses
Right.
in Boulder a little bit less competitive, but do we have anything that speaks to the actual impact of a head tax on a business community, given the experience in these other towns?
I will look back through the research that was done the last time this was considered and follow up with you on that.
Okay. And I assume a head tax can be structured in a way so that it can either be minimized or exempted for nonprofits or very small businesses or low
Yes.
income.
Yes.
Okay. To me, that's something that might be looked at. I mean, we're a long way from doing anything, but it seems to me to be something to at least explore, because we're running up against mill levy caps. Our sales tax is extremely high. And, you know, to create more wiggle room for either new programs or services, you know, God help us, we might have to actually cut a program somewhere. And we certainly don't want to do that. So it would be worth looking at to see whether there are, you know, the head tax is actually a worthwhile vehicle.
Thanks, Mark. Aaron?
Yeah, thanks for the very informative presentation. Appreciate it as always. A couple things. One is, so we are up close to our mill levy cap in the charter. So that would require voter change. Of course, raising property taxes would also require voter change. Does that require something fancy, like a two-step, like 1 year you ask the voters to change the charter and raise the cap, and then the next year you could ask for additional property tax revenue? Or could you do those in one vote or two votes at the same time?
So I might invite Sandra or Tom to jump in, but I think that last week for the library district conversation, David Gear drafted sample ballot language of what that would look like. And I believe it was all in one question.
I noticed that in the packet, and so it'd be good to get that confirmed that that's doable, or tell me otherwise.
I could look in the packet, but I believe that that is true. Yeah, I'll check and answer back here in a minute.
Okay, great, thanks. Not that I'm saying that we should raise it any higher than that. I saw that in the packet on the library district. I was curious what it would take if we were interested in it at some point. And the next question is, so you were talking about how there are fewer sales and more service purchases, right? So that's where more and more purchases are going are to services. Do we have a sense of like what services don't have any taxes on them but could be taxed? Do we have a list somewhere of the potential service areas that could have taxes placed on them?
So we could certainly provide a pretty exhaustive list. Things that are typically discussed are personal services such as hair salons, barbers, nail salons, fitness classes, veterinary services, things like that, personal services such as that, which I think fitness services in Boulder would probably generate a lot.
Okay, thanks. That's all my questions.
Mm-hmm.
Rachel and anyone else?
Okay, I guess I have kind of two buckets of questions. The first is around progressive taxes and that notion of progressive being the better type and regressive being bad. So I understand we cannot tax income, like employment income. So I just wanted to remind the public of that. And is that the most progressive, or is taxing income an example of a progressive tax?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes.
So given that that's not an option due to state law, what are other examples of progressive taxes, or how can you get it at that outcome the best? For example, following up on Aaron's question, is taxing some sort of services or luxury items considered progressive?
I think analyses of the sales tax have indicated that to the extent you can introduce more services and that it does move the needle from more aggressive to more neutral, because yes, you're taxing more things that people with higher income will be spending a greater proportion of their income on. And so by broadening the base, you are improving, I think, the sales tax in terms of regressivity.
Okay, that helps. I think I might be curious, the next time we come back to this conversation, like, is there some sort of a list or a playbook of like, here's the most progressive, or here are at least 5 things that are progressive taxes that you could consider doing. And then within something like services, everybody needs a haircut. So that could be regressive in some ways, I guess, but are there, can you say a certain if you're spending $800 on a haircut, we're going to assume that's going to fall into the progressive category. But if you are, spending 15, that's probably not a luxury item. So I just wonder if there are things like that we can do. And in terms of luxury items, I'm wondering, I guess for my next bucket of questions, what do we currently tax for cars, like personal car ownership? I don't know, or fees, what we collect maybe when you register your car as a city. I know that on-street parking is sometimes considered, I don't know if that's progressive or regressive, and if you can do it based on the car's value, I could see it maybe being more progressive. So just wanted to get more information on that too.
So what I know about cars is, the sales tax is applied at the straight rate. So the higher value car you buy, you'll pay more in tax. And then also the specific ownership tax that you pay when you register your car is based upon the value of the car, so it declines as your car ages. And so that's a state imposed tax that then flows to the city.
Okay. I wasn't sure if, I guess I didn't remember it being a city tax. So we do recoup that tax or fee when you register your car or annually?
Yeah, a portion of the specific ownership tax flows to the city.
Okay. And then on truly luxury or higher end cars, do we have room to impose additional, or does state law prohibit us from looking at that?
I would ask Tom or Sandra. I think that there's caution with regard to some of those.
And that's fine to come back to that one. And then the other part of my question was just, do we charge anything for outside of districts where there is our parking meters? Like I park in front of my house, or have we looked at capturing that at all, at charging, for registration or on-street parking, just a flat fee maybe?
So I see.
Would that be progressive or regressive? What's that?
I said, I see Yvette is on the call. I know we have some neighborhood parking programs, but I'm not super familiar with how they operate.
Hi, Kara.
Hi, Yvette.
Hi, that wasn't fair. We'll be back. We're happy to come back on June 22nd with our recommendations after we have concluded our conversations with the relevant boards and commissions so that we can reflect that in the memo. At this time, there is a conversation about MPPs and how they're priced, which is consistent with prior council direction. And we'll just want to look forward to your input on June 22nd. Anything's possible, Rachel, but everything's not so easy.
Yeah, that's a fair statement. Thank you.
All right.
Mark?
Yeah, just one last question. We've looked at a number of different alternatives this evening, and your presentation clearly articulated all of them. Does staff have a recommendation as to which are the most likely to be beneficial in terms of revenue generated and fairest, in terms of progressivity? I guess I'm asking, what is your thought as to the best areas to pursue if we choose to generate some more revenue?
I can answer that, Carl.
I was going to say Cheryl.
So certainly, to me, the largest revenue source are property and sales tax. But the downside of pursuing that much further is all the disadvantages that Cara has mentioned, especially at the levels that we're at with some of those. And we've not done studies on, if you raise sales tax X%, how's that going to affect both the residents and the businesses? So we would have to do more research to come up with a recommendation. Certainly, like you mentioned, the head tax is an area, because of the high end commuting that we have in Boulder, that we could raise taxes, but that again has similar consequences that are out there, and we would again need to do more research on that. Some of the smaller fees that we've looked at, the transportation fee, I do believe transportation is further looking at that, with coming up with some sort of recommendation in the next couple of years. That certainly could generate, and something where it pays for the use of our roads, which of course we all know the roads and the other forms of transportation have a lot of maintenance needs. So those to me are the areas I would look at further. I don't know, Cara, if you have further thoughts on that.
I think I would basically agree with that. I think one of the takeaways that we did sort of want to impart is Boulder has sort of reached into the toolbox and used a lot of tools already when compared to other cities across the state. So I do think broadening the sales tax base is something to think about and consider. I know it has been talked about across the state for a while by a number of different cities as well as the state.
Given the very high usage of our open space these days, if open space has taken a look at something as simple as parking fees, even parking fees for non-residents? I mean, has that even been considered?
Kara, do you want me to take that?
Sure.
All right. So when we come back, there's a couple different ways to approach this. And again, I anticipate providing more information on June 22nd in collaboration with the AMPS goals that we're working on with transportation and mobility. What we want to make sure is that we can do this in an equitable fashion that doesn't then have a negative impact on the businesses that people are trying to get to for their employment, to conduct their business, or to get services that contribute to our general fund. So it is possible to have different rates for different groups of people. You can see that even now in the way we're approaching, for example, in the garages 3 for 3. It is possible on street, but not done very often. Relatively hard to do in on-street parking, Mark. And we don't charge everywhere for on-street today. Again, I want to remind council that on-street parking contributes directly to the general fund, and district garage parking goes to support those districts. So also wanted to point that out.
I was thinking mostly in terms of some of our open space parking lots. If you go to El Dorado State Park, you can have as many people in the car as you want, but it's an $8 fee to park.
Right.
And I don't know if that's worthwhile to consider for it.
We could certainly look at that as part of the way we're approaching MPP, as we did with Chautauqua. But there will be residential impacts in the areas around there. So we want to be thoughtful about that as well, and not to quell visitation that might be price sensitive. So I also see Sandra's hand to answer a question. Did that help?
Yes.
Thank you.
Anything else, Mark?
I'm done. Thank you.
Sandra?
Yeah, I just wanted to circle back on this question from Aaron, and I did confirm that the way that David had written the ballot, it included both the charter amendment issue and also the tax issue. So I do believe that we could move forward with those at the same time. And then just to follow up with Rachel's question, and I believe, if I understood correctly, is that whether or not we could tax more expensive cars at a higher rate. Is that right?
Yeah, I guess just what are our options for, truly luxury vehicles if the state's giving us a portion. Do we have any options for fees or additional ways to capture some sort of progressive tax on those or money?
So to be honest with you, I don't know the answer. I mean, I think in just Googling it, there is a cap on the total tax, but I would have to look into it more, to be honest.
Okay, and it could be, it seems like maybe a fee as well, right? If taxes, and maybe we don't want to do it. I was, any time that you have the answer is fine for me. Not a rush. Thanks.
Thank you, Sandra. Just doing a time check here. We got 25 minutes left allotted for this item. Sam and Mary, I saw your hands up. Are you both okay? Good? Okay, cool. We're gonna move on to feedback then. What I would suggest to do here is everybody take their shot and probably only speak to what you're very interested in or very not interested in, and everything else we'll just sort of leave as is as far as staff direction goes. So anyone want to kick us off with feedback? Bob?
Well, I'll start out as the grouchy anti-taxer. While this was very helpful to understand what options we might have to raise taxes in various ways and be fees in various ways, what I think is missing from this analysis and needs to be brought forward before we make any decisions is what it is that we need. It feels like we're talking about raising taxes and then figuring out how to spend it later. I don't doubt that our budget could use some additional funding, particularly coming out of COVID. I don't doubt that there are many things that we would love to do by way of services for our community members. But I think we need to first identify the need, and then we could talk about the tax or the fee, in part because we need to know how much, in part we need to agree that there is a need, and in part because the tax or the fee might be tailored to that particular service. So I think this discussion contrasts with the community culture safety tax discussion, which we're going to have here in a few minutes, which does have identified needs. And so I think that's the way to handle these things. So I guess my answer is none of the above until and unless we have identified needs. And so I would ask staff at our next session on taxes and fees or even budget to tell us what it is, what services that we think the community wants that we're not providing. And then we can talk about how we get revenue for those.
Aaron, Sam, and then Mary.
This has been very instructive. I'm not in a rush to add any particular new taxes. This is a very challenging financial time for members of our community, whether people who live here or small businesses, et cetera. So I know we do have some budget gaps that I'm hoping we'll be able to fill with increased sales taxes and ARPA funds and such. But I'm not in a rush to add any brand new taxes. With that said, I think for the longer term, looking at what services might be taxable in ways that are not regressive is, I think, an interesting thing to consider for our kind of long-term fiscal stability with the shift away from purchasing goods and towards buying services. So I'd love to see some analysis of that, not right away. I don't think I'd try to impose anything this year, but kind of for our longer term fiscal stability, I think that would be really instructive to look into, like what some other communities along the Front Range are doing in terms of services, and are there ones that could be either neutral or progressive, luxury services of some kind, for example. So for the longer term discussion, I'm interested in that. I specifically, of the ones we talked about, I wouldn't look into a head tax right now. Like I say, our small businesses are struggling, and it would be a challenge to craft one in a way that wouldn't be damaging to some of our businesses that are already struggling. I'll say on a kind of a lighter note, if we did ever impose a head tax, I think we would need to name it the Matt Applebaum honorary head tax, as he has been the strongest advocate for that over decades. So if any future council ever does that, they should do that as part of it. Thanks.
Sam, then Mary, and Mirabai.
Great. Well, thank you. I would start by saying that I think our needs are pretty well identified. I mean, we have a backlog of capital maintenance and improvements and facilities needs that run up into the many hundreds of millions of dollars. And I think in our transportation master plan study, we identified needs, both maintenance and capital there. So I don't think there's any dearth of identified needs. You might talk to the library champions for another example. So I think staff has done a pretty good job of keeping current the needs that we have and where the gaps are. I'm kind of with Bob and Aaron. I don't think right now is the time to be adding to it, but I would say the top two for me to look at is transportation utility fee. We've made great progress at the state level this year with the transportation funding bill that hopefully will go forward. It might make good sense once that's done and in place for the city to look at its needs. I think to the question of regressive taxes, I think we would want to design any of those to be careful not to impact folks with lower incomes or less wealth in the process. But I would say transportation utilities fee is at the top of the list. I would also say, I think a head tax, and particularly one that exempts the smallest businesses and the nonprofits, would be something to look at. So again, that would have to be crafted well. And as long as we're naming things for former council members, another one to look at would be a Steve Pomerantz private parking fee, because we do another way to generate revenue would be, a private parking fee specifically targeted at businesses with lots of end commuters, and how you would put that together and who would pay it. Super complicated. There'd be a lot of resistance to it, but I think it's also one we're talking about that could be designed to be not regressive. But in the near term, I would say the one that's most interesting to me is that transportation utility fee. Thanks.
Mary Mirabai, Mark.
Thank you, Adam. So I would like to agree with Aaron on exploring services. And I don't know about haircuts, but I think people with long hair would pay less and people with short hair would pay more. So I don't know how you figure that one out, but just a comment. And I would also like to agree with Sam on the transportation utility. With the head tax, we actually came really close, but it was, we weren't identifying the specific place to use it. And that was that.
There he is, frozen for me and probably most others. So we're going to come back to her to make additional comments. I'll get her back in the queue when she comes back. Mirabai, Mark, Rachel.
Thanks, Adam. Thank you, staff. That was a great presentation. Yeah, I'll be joining the bandwagon. I don't really support any additional taxes at this time, or really too many moving forward. I think that currently we're making it really difficult on the residents that already live here. We hear that constantly, that it's a struggle to pay their mortgages and their yearly property taxes and et cetera, because we continue to tax items. And I mean, even like, I don't buy sweet drinks here anymore. We go outside of Boulder to do so. And so if that's a council member doing that, I can't imagine how many other people do that as well. And as we continue to tax items, like if we start taxing haircuts and more, I'm afraid we're going to continue to push people to go buy to surrounding towns. So if we are going to ever move forward with anything, the only thing I personally would consider supporting is something for out of town users on our open space. That's definitely something I've always been an advocate of. And the only other, if we did a sales or a head tax, again, there'd have to be very specific parts of the legislation written in that protects our small businesses, because they've been hit extremely hard, and putting any further pressure on them, I think, is not wise at this point. So that's kind of about where I'm sitting.
All right, I'm going to go back to Mary now that she's back. The last thing we heard was your agreement with Sam.
Yeah, I agree with Sam, the transportation utility tax as well, and the sentiments on the head tax. To that, I wanted to add the idea of adding an excise tax to storage facilities. We've had a number of stories where we got a lot of feedback about them because they're just really bright at night, and not so much to raise funds, but to discourage that kind of use and perhaps encourage a more desired use. That sounds to me, what I just said sounds like a bigger project than what is before us. So I would be interested in just finding out what that might look like in terms of, is it per location, per number of units, per square feet? How does that work? And what is the rationale behind the communities that have implemented such a tax? So, and I agree with the sentiment that now is not the time, although we have lots and lots of needs, which those of us on the Financial Strategy Committee have grown very intimately familiar with.
Thank you, Mary. Mark, Rachel, and then Aaron again, and then Junie.
Yeah, I'm going to join the parade. This is obviously not a time for raising any taxes. This is just a question of dipping a toe in the water and taking a look at what taxes, if we needed them, if we decided the time was right, what we might consider as raising sufficient revenue to be worth the effort, and looking at those things that might be initiated without driving away businesses or unduly burdening businesses. So, I mean, I would be interested in looking at what services might be subject to a sales tax without doing that, without those adverse impacts. I would be interested, just because the concept has been bandied about frequently, to understand a head tax a little better, and to understand what its impact might be, both in terms of its impact on the business community and its revenue generating possibilities. And I would join with Mirabai in saying, as I mentioned earlier, I'd like to at least understand what might be possible in terms of the several million people who come to our open space every year, largely from out of town with their vehicles. And is there a reasonable revenue generating possibility there? None of that to be done immediately, but I'm optimistic that times will get better, and there may be an opportunity to do one of these things somewhere down the road. Those are the ones I would choose.
Thank you, Mark. Rachel?
Thanks, Adam. Okay, so my feedback, I understand that it is a lot of people's belief that it's not a time to raise taxes, and I would agree. We are all recovering from COVID, but it's a perfectly great time to plan for the next taxes we may need to collect. So I'm glad we're having this conversation and look forward to learning more. Several people have mentioned a concern about sort of driving people to neighboring towns, and I agree that's a big concern. So one thing I wonder is could we look at a regional approach, sort of like they were doing with minimum wage, where a whole coalition of Front Range towns maybe would look at implementing, I guess, researching what is best practices for a progressive tax on services, and then implementing it ideally at the same time, so that we're not driving people from one town to another. So just one concept maybe that we could look at. On the head tax, I would definitely want to better understand what the negatives are from the business community. It seemed like I recall there were some major issues, and so I'm happy to learn more, but I would really want to involve the people who would be directly impacted before I really gave any even direction on this. In general, what I would hope to see at the next time we commune around this is some kind of a progressive tax list, like I mentioned, and ideally implementation, if possible, of the racial equity instrument around that and bringing that into the discussion. And then also making sure that we are lining up these considerations with our master plans. So like when I ask about cars and parking, and we know it's in our transportation master plan to try and get people to shift modes of transportation. So how are the taxes that we're going to look at, or the fees, dovetailing with our values and goals on things like transportation and resiliency? And then last thing, it was mentioned about maybe charging it at open space parking lots, and at least for people who are residents. I would not want to see us doing that, because you have to be pretty well off to live in walking distance of open space trails, like the really good ones that a lot of people like to hike at. So that would have a negative impact on people that really need to use car or, you know, some different mode of transportation, but often cars to get to those places, which is why we have the parking lots. So that's my feedback. Thanks.
We got about 10 minutes to bring this home. We got Aaron and then Junie.
I'll wait for Junie to go first and then I'll go.
All right, sounds good.
Thank you, Aaron. I do have a question actually too, before I make my comment. And I'm not sure if that was mentioned earlier. I'm sorry if I didn't capture it. Well, for the occupation taxes, because I'm looking at liquor and utilities, as was mentioned by some of my colleagues, once these taxes are levied, are they passed on to customers? Because I'm thinking, for instance, liquor. Can, let's say, someone who owns a liquor store pass the price, or I guess, can they pass these fees to customers?
So yeah, for the liquor occupation tax, I think it is thought of as a cost of doing business to the extent it impacts the prices of their products. I don't know, you know, it's competitive. Some of those excise taxes do get directly passed along as a line item. The utility occupation tax, I'm pretty sure Excel did a calculation of, you know, the lump sum amount that was due to the city and divide that by their sales tax forecast and put a rate onto people's bills. So I think it varies for the different taxes, how they are possibly passed along.
Yeah, no, thank you for this. Because I mean, we do have a university on our backyard, and we have a lot of customers if we're thinking of college students who drink. So I was thinking, okay, maybe a occupation taxes on liquor, but the way you explain it, that doesn't mean it gets passed on to the customer. Again, liquor is not something that you need like food, so I can understand, you know, having a tax like that. But as far as property taxes, I don't think that's something that we should pursue, not now, not maybe even next year, because again, we were thinking about a property tax, you know, in relations to the library. So I think that's just gonna be, you know, where does it stop? Again, we want to protect whether it's businesses, but also there are people in this community who are struggling when it comes to taxes. And I understand this idea about progressive taxes instead of, you know, sales tax, which is regressive. But nonetheless, I still believe that we all contribute to the community. We all have to contribute. So I'm not opposed to sales tax, because I think in some food items, you don't pay any taxes. And if you're low income and you get food stamps, I don't think you pay taxes on those. So I think sales taxes, in a way, it's not a bad thing because we all contribute. And sometimes I pay sales taxes, and I'm probably one of the persons on council with the least amount of income. But I'm happy with my contribution to the community, to society, to make Boulder better. So somehow I don't look at sales taxes as something that is bad. And I'm sure that may not be the view of some of my colleagues. But again, I think maybe an accommodation tax might be good because I'm thinking of COVID. Yes, there are challenges right now, but I'm thinking once things reopen, you know, the market will be re-energized. People will, you know, start going, visiting Boulder more. So I think that might be a good opportunity to start thinking of what that would look like. But also I think what I heard as well, which I agree with, no matter what taxes aside from some of the excise taxes that we mentioned earlier, is that we have to think of, you know, low-income people, and we have to think about waivers for them as well. And I think that's very important. The red light cameras, fee or charge, I think that's an okay idea. Parking violations, I suppose that could work as well. Open space, we're thinking of community members, but there are also people who are coming outside of Boulder as well, who are using open space, who are also low income. So I think we still have to think about these things. So I think for me, what I would like to see is no matter what taxes that we decide we're gonna go with, or you know, whatever taxes that staff want to bring forward, is thinking about it critically in a way that, okay, what will be the impact on low-income people in this community, but also even maybe low-income community members coming from surrounding regions. So yeah, I think we're on the right track. But again, I think one of our colleagues mentioned earlier, there's really no action to be taken right now because we're not really making decision on a specific issue or a specific item that needs to be, that needs funding right now.
Aaron.
So I just neglected to weigh in on the transportation utility tax. I also support continuing to move forward on that. Not this year, but I know it was delayed by COVID, but I think it should go back on the work plan to investigate how that might work for consideration in the future year. Thanks.
Thanks, Aaron. And I will give my input. I agree with most of everybody here as far as priorities go and what mechanisms we should be looking at. I think there are plenty of things that need funding. One that wasn't mentioned was we're trying to get to 15% permanently affordable housing by 2030. That alone could use hundreds of millions of dollars to ever actually happen, especially as the market continues to go up, up, up. So I see no lack of funding needs, just a lot of lack of funding mechanisms. In that vein, I'm very interested in some sort of head tax, and I would love for anyone on city staff to tell me if we can aim it specifically at publicly traded companies. Those are the ones who tend to continue to have the most amount of money through the pandemic, continue to move here because it is a beautiful space that is attracting a workforce that they want and has very little to do with them hurting because of them being a small business. So if anyone can answer me that question at any point, I would really, really, really like you. And along those lines, I still think we could tailor it in a way that would not affect small businesses or nonprofits. So that's the number one in my head for future options, especially if we can aim it towards that permanently affordable housing goal. I also really like Mary's idea of storage facilities. That's such a luxury thing in my mind for a lot of people. It means you have so much stuff, you need an additional place to store it. That means you don't have to sell that stuff to make your rent usually. So definitely interested in something along those lines in the future too. Those are my biggest interests. Everything else I think can be left at the wayside for the time being. I saw staff taking really diligent notes, but I'll try to just sum up a few of the biggest things I heard. I think it would be super helpful if we could get the memo and information on the head tax from the 2016-2017 discussion so that those who are interested can look through what's already been done and we could expand on that in the future. There's also big interest in a transportation utility fee and some parking fees for open space, and all of these taxes need to be progressive at all times. So Those are the main headlines that I heard for sure. But I saw you taking great notes. So anything else anyone wants to add before we move on? We're right at time. Perfect. Thank you so much, everybody. Awesome conversation, and I hope you have what you need to move forward.
I do. Thank you very much.
So
All
if we're ready to move on to the next, just a thank you to Cara and the whole team. I think they did an incredible job of giving you an abundant amount of information in a digestible and accessible format. So thanks so much for the team, and I'll invite Cheryl and Tom for the next presentation.
And before we go there, Sandra has something to add.
Yeah, Adam, I just wanted to address your question, and I don't know the answer off the top of my head. I think that it could possibly be something that we could look at in terms of, you know, a head tax for publicly traded companies. I think that my concern when I first heard you say it is just sort of an equal protection argument, but I believe that we can provide a rational basis that we could probably do that. I think it's just a matter of being able to articulate what that would look like. So I can certainly look into that more for you and get back to you.
That would be a great option, at least to look at. Thank you, Sandra.
Yeah.
All right, on to the next one.
So I am starting this one off, just waiting for the presentation to come up. And thanks, Emily, for doing the presentation for us. Next slide, please. So tonight we're going to talk about, I'll start it off with the Community Resilience and Safety Tax Renewal. And this, as we all know, was formerly known as the Community Culture and Safety Tax. And then Tom will discuss Charter Committee recommendations related to the November ballot. Next slide. Actually, 2 slides. Just a brief history of our capital investment strategies over the last decade. And these really relate to more of our general fund, unrestricted strategies. Utilities has their own funding, same with open space and some of our restricted funds. In 2011, we issued a capital bond, which funded 100 city projects. Some of the projects included the main library renovation, the Wild End Fire Station. And then in 2014, we went to the voters and asked for a 0.3% sales and use tax. This was called the Community Culture and Safety Tax, and it was a 3-year tax. We had 5 city projects and 2 community projects. Some of the city projects included the civic area redevelopment, Boulder Creek improvements, public arts, and the 2 community projects were for Dairy Center and Museum of Boulder renovations. We then went back to the voters in 2017, asking for a 4-year extension of this tax. It included 6 city projects, radio infrastructure, Scott Carpenter Fire Station 3 was some of them, as well as 7 community projects, Growing Gardens, Bamoka, Studio Arts were some of those projects. Some of the feedback we heard, we decided to utilize some of our ongoing revenue in the general fund to start what we call a general fund capital fund. So we put around $6 million of our annual operating revenue into this capital fund to support capital projects in the general fund. Some of the projects we've been supporting are broadband, the Boulder Community Hospital deconstruction, as well as our new human resource system. And tonight I'm going to talk about yet another extension of the 0.3% sales tax. The Financial Strategy Committee has kind of rebranded it as the Community Resilience and Safety Tax. And really the focus here is to address part of our 300 million plus unfunded capital needs here at the city. Next slide. So we came to council in February to talk about the potential extension of this tax and what are the next steps. And the last several months, both the Council Financial Strategy Committee and staff have been hard at work to provide this update tonight on the tax. So we started in February with establishing guiding principles for both the community and the city portion of this tax. Those guiding principles can be found as an attachment to your memo. We also engaged an outside expert for outreach surveys and polling. So that was some of the direction council gave regarding a community survey. We are utilizing a firm called Magellan to help us through that. In April, we really turned our focus to looking at the citywide capital projects. We had 2 half-day sessions with departments to review their high priority projects. So we'll be talking a little bit about that later tonight. And we also started work on the community survey. We have a draft of the community survey as we speak, and we are working to revise to hopefully send that out in the next couple weeks. Then we also will be working on engaging the community on the community nonprofit portion of this tax. All of this work, along with getting results of the survey, will be done in the next few months, and we will come back to council in July with a final recommendation. So the recommendation will be coming from the Council Financial Strategy Committee to you in July, and hopefully in August, come up with the ballot language to approve the final ballot language. Next slide. So I'll start with the survey. The structure of the survey, Magellan expects that we will get about 500 to 1,000 respondents, which is considered statistically valid. It's going to be sent to registered Boulder voters, but it is open to all because it is part of the survey is online. It will be sent or given 3 ways. There will be text sent out with a link to the online survey, going online itself, and then also through the phone. We will have Spanish translation, but I'll note it really is only for the written parts of the survey. So the main online survey will be translated in Spanish. We have 4 major areas that we want to get feedback from the community on. The first is the term of the tax. When we came to you in February, that was one of the things we talked about and got direction. And the direction was we really want a minimum of 10 years. So we will be polling both 10 and 15-year terms for this capital tax. Debt issuance. So as we know, the cost of construction or the inflation there has been far exceeds our cost of borrowing. So when we look at these projects, we want to be financially prudent in how we go about this and be given the flexibility that if we want to upfront these projects and issue debt for them, that we'll be able to do so. So we're looking at 80 million for 10 years and up to 110 million for 15 years. We don't think we would go that far, but again, we want to have the flexibility in case we need to. The third area for the survey is just testing the projects in general, and I'll talk a little bit about those projects next. And then last, what portion should be city versus what portion should be for community nonprofit. The Financial Strategy Committee is recommending 10 or 15% for the community portion. A lot of that percentage has to do with the fact that there are so many infrastructure needs here at the city. Next slide. So here's just information on our latest and greatest sales tax revenue estimates that we received from CU this month. For the 10-year tax, we're estimating that we will get up to 127 million. We are using a 3% inflationary factor, and then 15-year up to 200 million. And what this table shows is the breakout between city and community. So if city was 85, community was 10, for instance, in the 10-year, the city would get about 108 over the life of the tax, and the community 13 million. And of course, in both scenarios, the first year revenue would be the same. For the city, anywhere between 9.9 and 10.4 million a year, and then for community, 1.2 to 1.7. Next slide. So here's the debt. Again, we're working on the final amounts and rates. Our issuance amounts up to 80 and 110 million is what we are going to put in the poll, or the survey, I'm sorry. And the interest rates we're using are higher than what we could get if we borrowed today, but we're recognizing that there are major inflationary pressures right now, and typically when inflation goes up, interest rates do as well. So we're using more of a historical average of interest rates to calculate or to determine our debt issuance. So the annual debt service, as you can see, in both of these cases would be equivalent to the year one collection for the city. So we really don't think we would go that high, but we certainly would want the flexibility. And then this shows the total repayment amount, which includes principal and interest repayment. Next slide. So now I'll start talking about the high priority projects for the community survey. And again, I just want to make it clear that in the survey, it will be worded as these projects may be funded. So we recognize that this has not been vetted through the entire council or through all the proper means. We did want to come with projects that we do believe, and the Financial Strategy Committee believes, are very important for funding in the near future for the city. So I'll go through these. First, we have the Boulder Fire. As we know, Station 3, unfortunately, given the high cost of land and the construction increases, we have about an $11 million budget gap to finish that project. We also want to leave some funding in case an opportunity were to come along for land for stations 2 or 4. Transportation network maintenance, it's just various maintenance projects throughout the entire network, not just the roads, but also the bike paths and everything else. Parks and Rec, Boulder Creek corridor remediation and renovations at East Boulder Rec Center. And then outreach and customer service technology upgrades. The first is our constituent relationship management system, or the CRM system that our residents currently utilize to report certain problems that they see, like a pothole. And then the second is Enterprise Data Warehouse, which you may be wondering what that is. It will provide for a central repository of data so that robust data analysis can be conducted. So right now our data is currently in several different systems that's hard to get at. And the Enterprise Data Warehouse will help greatly help with outcome and key performance indicator reporting, both internally and public facing. Next slide. So I mentioned that we are still in the drafting of this survey, and there are some possible additional projects that may be on the survey. We think it will be more in a broad category area than specific mention of projects like the previous slide. There's some Boulder, the fire department replacing station 2 or 4, the actual construction of those stations, advanced paramedicine capital equipment that's related to advanced life support, smart traffic signal system maintenance in transportation, renovations of both the North and the South Boulder Rec Centers, and then also renovation and build outs of East Mapleton and Valmont Parks, and then a couple climate initiatives such as utility undergrounding and streetlight acquisition. Next slide. So turning to the community portion, again, the Financial Strategy Committee is recommending either 10% of the annual tax allotment. And we are also recommending that we do not put specific projects on the ballot. if you all remember back with CCS 1 and 2, it kind of was a situation where if you're ready to go and shovel ready for a project at this point in time, you can get funded. If you're not ready to go, if you don't have the money for planning of a project that you might need, then you might be out of luck. So what the committee felt was that a more fair way to handle this is to have a grant program similar to what we do with the arts, where we take the annual allocation amount and we have specific criteria and for project selection that we go through. We do an annual process, and we might give the money all to one nonprofit or break it up between several smaller nonprofits. But they really felt that this was a better way to handle the community portion of this tax. So what we plan to do in the next month or two is to have target outreach to a broad set of our community nonprofits. We've already heard from a few of them, but we're looking to send letters and information regarding what this tax structure might look like and criteria for project selection, in hopes that we can generate some public support for this tax when it goes to the ballot in November. Next slide. So back to the next steps. Again, we'll be sending out the survey, engaging community, and coming back to you with both results of those efforts as well as final recommendations on those 4 areas that we talked about, and then approving the final ballot language in August. Next slide. So these are the questions that we have for you this evening. Adam, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Cheryl.
Thanks.
So we'll go through these one at a time. First of all, any questions? And do we mind taking them down just so we can see everybody? Thank you. Bob?
Yeah, I have 2 questions, and I'll reserve my comments until after the questions are done. 2 questions, Cheryl. One is, I didn't quite follow the very last bit about the nonprofits. So this spring or summer, you're going to reach out to nonprofits and hear what they have to say. And then what are we going to do with that information? I didn't quite follow that to the end.
So it's just more, we're basically going to use that information to determine if we have the support, and also if there's anything that we need to follow up further with the nonprofits on, and also get information on how they feel we already have information on how projects might be selected just based on our former work with CCS, but we also want to get input from them on things that we should consider that perhaps we hadn't considered in the past.
So how would that affect our ballot language? If we're not going to identify certain projects this year, which I get and I fully support, and I understand we have criteria, and we've been through this process a couple times before, so we're probably pretty good at it. But I'm just still trying to understand what we're going to do with that information and how that will affect the ballot measure.
I don't think that it necessarily would affect the ballot language itself, but it would give us an idea of the type of support that we have from the community nonprofits. Really, that's the intention there.
So in other words, if a community nonprofit said, well, yeah, I've got this really swell project, and I think that I'll ultimately be eligible for a grant in a couple of years, we would say to them, that's great. We hope you support our ballot measure, and then maybe you can apply in a year or two. Is that kind of what we're thinking?
Yeah.
Okay, I get it. Thanks. And then my second question, again, I'll keep my comments till later because I do have some comments. If we allocated 10 or 15% of this to grants for nonprofits for community projects, does that still allow us to have the bond issues, a tax-free municipal bond?
To have.
If we went out with debt, can we still do it as a tax-free municipal bond and therefore have a lower interest rate?
We could, if we were intending to use some of it for these, depending on what these nonprofit projects were, like if we did want to front load some of that, then we would probably have to issue a portion of it as taxable, but certainly the majority would be tax exempt.
So so if let's say we settled on 10%, does that mean that we'd have 10% of our bonds issued as taxable and 90% as non-taxable, or does it matter the type of project determines whether they're taxable or not?
It just depends on the type of the project, not necessarily the breakout of, we would have to look at our cash flows and what our plans are for funding these projects. We might determine that, like we did with CCS, we thought we might have taxable, but with the cash flows, we actually didn't need to issue any taxable debt. We did that as pay as you go for the nonprofit portion.
Right. No, and I think that was easier when there was a 3 or 4 year tax. When it's a 10-year tax, I guess our choices would be to issue taxable bonds, or we would have to really, really stretch those. If we're doing pay as we go, we would really have to stretch those grants out over a pretty long period of time, unless we want to loan the money ourselves, right? But we're talking a lot of money. I mean, that's $10 or $15 million at 10%.
Correct. I mean, the intent from the committee discussion was to have a set amount every year.
I see.
Rather than front load. I mean,
I got, okay, that's helpful. So what we would say to the nonprofits is, let's say we went 10 years, that's $100 million, and 10% is $10 million. What we'd say is, we're going to have $1 million a year available for grants. We're not going to have 10 million available. We're going to have $1 million a year for 10 years available for grants. And here's our criteria. Is that what you're saying?
correct.
I got it. Okay, then I see how
Sorry
the
for the confusion.
no, well that helps, because I see now why the taxability of the bonds are not relevant, because we wouldn't bond for that portion. Great. Okay, I'll save the rest for comments. Thanks.
Rachel and Mary.
Yeah, thanks for that presentation, Cheryl. My question is also on the nonprofit funding pool aspect. And I'm sorry if this was in the packet. Sounds like we've done this before, so I'm sure it's kind of wrote or automated. But who will vet or review grant applications?
So we have not, in the past, it has been, at least for CCS, it was a group of staff, and I believe there were a few council members involved in that as well. We have not fully determined all of that detail yet. So
Okay.
it's something that council can have discussion on and make recommendations.
Okay, because obviously with the arts grant applications, they are so voluminous that we just had to, put on a ballot measure to add commission members for that group, just to vet those applications. So I wanted to make sure we were thinking through that, and also to know whether that needs to go into the ballot, like it would, we're using this, and here's the general way that these would be reviewed. So I wasn't sure.
Okay. Thanks.
And Mary.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I don't have any questions, but I wanted to just sort of add a little bit to staff's wonderful presentation. A comment on the Parks and Rec. It was listed as Parks and Rec, but I think that the upgrades to the North Boulder Rec Center and South Boulder Rec Center would also fall under climate goals, because those pools, and this was in the memo, but this is more for the public's sake. They take up 50% of the city's energy use between those two, if I recall correctly. So I just wanted to add that. And then the other thing I wanted to add was with respect to the nonprofit portion of it. One of the reasons that we decided to go this route was, in the past and previous, the CCS grants of before, there was a committee that was set up front. And that committee was a committee of community members that were, wrote in, applied, and they were selected, I believe, by the city manager. And then they spent the better part of a month, probably, coming up to speed on taxes and how master plans work, all of that fundamental stuff. And we felt that there wasn't that kind of time to be able to do that and then vet the projects. The other reason was because the shovel-ready approach favors bigger organizations. So in the past, you saw that it was the dairy and the Museum of Boulder. And so those are bigger organizations that have, that occupy spaces. So we felt that in the interest of pursuing the goals of our racial equity plan, one of the things that we could do is, with this fixed amount of a little over $1 million a year, you could also serve smaller nonprofits and provide them with funds for things like a planning grant. Oftentimes small organizations, because they're so small, can't afford the staff time and the associated funds to be able to plan a project that they could bring forward and ask for money to fund. So it would be perhaps, you know, one year it would be a planning grant. The next year they would have planned their project, and then they would come and get the project funded. And so that was part of the rationale for the way that the committee structured it. And then finally, I'll just make a comment with respect to the rebranding of it as a community resilience and safety tax. One of the things that we've learned throughout COVID and through the kinds of climate disasters that we're seeing is that what we really need is, we need resilience, and we need our infrastructure to be resilient and in a condition that will get us through some of these upcoming challenges. So that's why we rebranded it as the community resilience and safety. So that's all the comments that I wanted to add to staff's presentation, and thank you.
Thank you, Mary. And we'll move on to the second question, which is, does council wish to consider a proposed ballot item to extend the expiring 0.3% sales and use tax? So feel free to line up and weigh in. I got Bob, Sam, Aaron.
I guess I have two comments. I don't know which of these questions were they're responsive to, so I'll just give you my two comments. First, I'm a little concerned that the questions for the survey were identified by the committee and staff without input from all of council. And I get the fact that those are not necessarily the ones that are going to be on the ballot, but I think it's going to put at a significant disadvantage any projects that were not selected for the survey if we come to talk about them in July. And we have a much longer list of projects, and maybe even some projects that are not even on that list. And if council members come forward in July and say, well, I think it should be this or that, and the response may be, well, we didn't survey for it, so we don't know. And so it feels to me like a little like we're winnowing right now, and I'm not happy about that. So I don't know what the answer is, because I'm a little surprised. I was surprised when I saw the memo a couple of days ago that we had that the committee of three and staff had decided what was going to be surveyed for and what was not going to be. So I don't know what the solution for that is, other than I suppose we can all look each other in the eye and say, well, but everything can be talked about even though it wasn't surveyed. But those things that were surveyed obviously are going to have a distinct advantage, especially if they survey well, over those things which are not surveyed. So I'm not happy about the process. I guess we are where we are. And short of surveying on everything, which I also realize is not practical, I would have much rather have this session have been a presentation to council and ask us, what do you think should be surveyed? And have us all 9 weigh in about what should be surveyed, and then do the survey rather than being told what's going to be surveyed. So I'm not happy about that aspect of this, but I guess we are where we are, and I don't think we have time to back up and adjust the survey. So I guess we're stuck with what's being presented to us. My second comment is pretty unrelated. I'm a little head scratching over the community part of this. I entirely get Mary's comment about the fact that it would be great to support smaller organizations and maybe even support things that are not necessarily capital based. but $1 million to $1.5 million a year is not very much money. And if as Cheryl said, we're not going to bond against it, that's all we will have is $1 million to $1.5 million a year. And if we look back at the 9 or 10 projects that we supported in the first iteration and the second iteration of the community culture safety tax, with one exception, all of the grants were either in the high 6 figures or the low 7 figures. That is, they were several hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars. At $1 million or $1.5 million a year, that doesn't get us many projects. Now, yeah, we can do a lot of $10,000 micro grants, and maybe that's what we're trying to achieve, but we wouldn't be able to substantially support any medium to large projects, the ones that might require a grant of $500,000 or $1 million, unless we want to shoot our wad and just give one grant a year to one organization. But if our intention is to grant many organizations each year, those are going to be grants that are going to be probably in the sub $100,000 grants. Some may only be tens of thousands. If that's our philosophy, that's fine. I just want to make that observation that this is very different than what we've done historically, where we've had several $1 million to dole out all at once. And it sounds like we're going to trickle it out in much smaller amounts over a period of 10 years. So I'm not necessarily against that. I just want to make an observation that it will foreclose us, if we don't bond against that part of it, it'll foreclose us from doing any big sizable projects. Those are my 2 comments.
May I respond, Adam?
Yes, please.
Bob, thank you for that. One of the reasons that the committee and along with staff chose the projects was because we spent 8 hours in presentations. It was 2 half days of full on presentations from different departments. And I suppose we could have asked the full council to set aside 2 half days to do that. But that is part of the reason. So just wanted to illuminate that.
Thank you, Mary. I have Sam, Aaron, and Mark. Sam, you're still on mute. Yep.
Yep, thank you. So I started, thanks, Adam, and I'll thank you again for reminding me I was on mute. This is a really well thought out presentation. I want to thank the subcommittee that helped pull it together from staff and council. It's a lot of work, as Mary just said. And it's really important because we're looking, and this was at staff suggestion, and I think it will serve the community better at a longer term extension. The first ones have been 3 and 4 years. This is 10 or 15. And I think, that meant that it took more time to tee up. So thank you for that. I also want to say that I think the projects that are identified are really important ones. I want to call out the safety part of this a little bit. I think the fire rescue facilities are important. Station 3 at the top of the list. We need to fund and complete that. I do want to highlight the advanced life support and paramedicine part of this. And I'd just like to put back to the committee and to staff that I think as important as fire stations 2 and 4, they are very old and they do need replacing. I think what we want on an equal footing with that, and what might cost less upfront and more operationally, is making sure that we are providing the best life support services we can with our fire response. So we've been over this. I won't harp on it, but if we're going to transition to the kind of medical emergency services that people think we have and expect that a city like Boulder should have, we need to be careful not to lose sight of that and not to have our capital needs around fire stations overwhelm the fact that we need to be supporting the transition of our fire department to doing good paramedicine and having every firefighter be a paramedic. So I think it's great that that is at the top of the list. And I think as far as resilience goes, that's a key part. It's a daily part of our resilience, but I don't want to lose sight of the paramedicine piece. And I want to emphasize that because it will save lives every year. Another one is transportation. I think it's great that that's there, and I want to emphasize it because even though this sounds like an ask of the city to maintain city infrastructure, the purpose of that city infrastructure is Vision Zero, getting people around safely. And I think pavement management is an important part of that, because where the roads deteriorate the most are the places on the road where alternative modes like bicycles and scooters end up spending a lot of their time. So for me, the reason that the transportation piece is important is not only for all the normal transportation reasons, but again, for the safety part of that. So I won't go down the rest of the list. I just wanted to highlight two of those that I think we want to not lose sight of. So the answer to the question is yes, I do want to see us move forward with this. Yes, I want to see the survey go forward. I think a big picture question, not just in the list of programs, but is in the balance between the community portion and the city portion. So kind of to Bob's point, and not weighing in so much on the big versus small piece of it. I think we need to be sure that we balance it enough that we have excitement among the nonprofits and our nonprofit partners that we will support, not only to support getting this across the finish line and approved by voters, but making sure that it is a understood, comprehensible way of donating funds, granting funds to our partners who help us do the work that a city needs to do that isn't in our government services wheelhouse. So I think this is a great start. I share Bob's concern only in the sense of wanting to make sure that we're balancing the grant portion of it with the rest of it that's going to go to fund unmet city capital needs. But I think the focus on resilience is critical. The focus on safety is critical. And I want to make sure that those are the priorities that we're featuring and that we bring along also our nonprofits will benefit. So thanks for that.
Thank you, Sam. Just as a quick time check, we have had about 20 minutes to finish this and all of the ballot items that council wants to bring up. So keep that in mind as you're making your comments. We have Aaron, Mark, and Rachel.
Great. So I'll talk for 20 minutes based on that comment, Adam. Thanks. So a few points, just recommendations on how we move forward. Yes, certainly on the tax, I think that's probably unanimous from council, I'm going to guess. I would ask that we add to the survey an option for 10, 15, or 20% funding for community projects. I think it's worth getting the pulse of the community on their opinions on that, because I think the community project funding in the past has been really transformative for individual nonprofits, and I think also for the community as a whole. So think about the Museum of Boulder or the renovation of the dairy and a variety of other really impressive projects. So I'd like to retain that option of that higher number and see what the community thinks about it in the survey, and then we could have a discussion obviously later on in the summer about what the number should be, but I'd like to hear that answer from the community. And Mary, I appreciate your point about the funding for smaller organizations in that community portion, which I think is a really great idea, and want us to be able to do that for sure. But to Bob's point, I think we also can't do those more transformative projects if all the grants are $50,000 or $60,000. So as we consider how we phrase this, both in the ballot language and in the granting process, I'd like to see us retain the ability to both do a number of smaller projects for organizations that don't have the support, Mary, like you were talking about, while also potentially working in a handful of bigger projects over the lifetime of the 10 or 15 years of the tax. So it'd be great if we could keep that in mind as we move forward. The other thing was, just to Bob's point, I mean, I understand why we got here this way, and I really appreciate the Financial Strategy Committee spending all those hours on it, analyzing all this. But I think we should, reserve some rights to when we get to the July decision points of determining projects at that time, and not be bound by precisely what's in the survey questions. And last point there, just that the listing of the possible things for the survey was in kind of bureaucratese. Didn't necessarily get across what was exciting about some of those projects. Like I think about, say, like pavement management. Like, well, that doesn't sound very exciting. What is that? As opposed to, say, like a rapid pothole, filling fund, or that's not very good either. But something like, it's like, hey, we're going to fix potholes much quicker if we do this, as opposed to like pavement management. So something to think about for the survey, and also for final language to give a little bit more descriptive things of why a community member might want to fund that. And that's it. Is that 20 minutes?
Thank you. I want to be responsive to a couple of the comments we've already heard. Bob, I understand your disappointment about not seeing the poll first, but time is a little bit short, and nothing in the poll precludes council from making its own decisions, as Aaron requested, on any particular item. If there's something that council wishes to include and in place of something else, that's their prerogative. That's certainly, up to the group. I also agree with Aaron's comment that on a couple of these items that we've enumerated, a little more pizzazz in the description and the marketing would be appropriate, and occasionally a little more plain English would be useful as well. With respect to Aaron's comment on the 20% option, Aaron, I think if you had sat through those half-day meetings and seen the scope of the capital needs of this city, of which we will be addressing less than half, even at a 15-year renewal, and you saw the number of items that are not going to be included, and with the knowledge that that list of items that we're not going to be able to address through this tax is only going to grow over the term of the renewal, I think it was our feeling that a much more conservative approach was warranted. If we're going to be serious about capital improvements, many of which are very appealing and some of which are not sexy at all, but all of which are necessary for the health of this city, we were disinclined to go higher and take funds away from the needs that need to be funded, things that need to be built, and services that need to be provided to our citizens. And so that was why we did not entertain the 20% option. That, of course, is another decision that council can make, but it was not our perspective that was a prudent way to go when you only get one shot at it for 15 years or 10 years, whatever the term may be. And so that's why we did not do the 20%. And I think we would probably urge that we not do that going forward. But again, it's another decision that's up to the will of council. Thank you.
Rachel, Mirabai, and Bob again.
Thanks, Adam. Is it possible to get the 3 questions that we're supposed to answer back up at this point, just to facilitate Adam's effort to be timely and make sure we're answering them? So yes, to question 2, I do want us to consider a proposed ballot item. And I guess to Bob's point, the first point on the survey coming to council a little bit late in the game, I really had not thought about to be unhappy about that, but for the reasons Bob expressed, I join him in that disappointment. And partly because the example Mark just gave of recommend 20% because of all this information that the subcommittee got. And I guess maybe I don't understand the purpose of this subcommittee as opposed to other ones I've been part of, which were they were very narrowly designed to focus on process, and we didn't get into substance. And if there were 2 days worth of presentations and advocacy that resulted in a winnowing of sort of candidates to get on the survey, and that's going to probably, as Bob said, give some a distinct advantage if they survey well, then that's that's really into substance. And I guess I just don't know that as a council, we authorize 2 to 3 people to winnow down information that is actually substantive. So I'm confused. It maybe could use more information on that. But it's concerning to me. I don't know if that was so definitive in terms of saying that the subcommittee members wanted to do 10 versus 20. I would think that we all need to have that same level of robust information download. And again, unless it may be a different kind of subcommittee, but usually my understanding has been process and not digging into like presentations and advocacy and getting into decisions that don't come before all council, but upon which we might disagree and that might impact real outcomes.
May I colloquy with you on that for a moment?
Please.
I don't believe we're making decisions. We're making recommendations. Council will make decisions. The winnowing that we did was for purposes of making a recommendation to this full council. We have made no decisions of any kind, and I would certainly urge all council members to and I'm sure staff could provide it for us, the full list of all departments and all requests for capital expenditures in connection with the renewal tax. And we're all free to go through it as painstakingly, unfortunately, as we did. But again, it was not for purposes of making a decision. This will be our best. This is not purely a process subcommittee. It's a committee to make a recommendation on financial strategies. And that's what we were planning to do. Having done so, if it does not meet the approval of this council, it can be changed or rejected as the entire body sees fit. There's nothing more to it than that, really, other than we have $300+ million of unfunded capital needs, and we were simply taking a stab at suggesting what we think might be those items that were most appropriate to fund. But if this council sees it differently, that's the way it will be. And there was no sense of doing other than making a recommendation.
May I colloquy as well? I guess I would like to start with a question for staff. Were the 2 4-hour meetings recorded?
I believe they were, Mary. I'd have to go look back and try to find no, but I believe I know the first one was, and I think about 3/4 the second one was. I didn't catch the first part. I think I forgot to turn on the button, but
okay.
They are recorded.
So if those could be made available for council, they could sit through those 2 sessions and watch for themselves or attend for themselves. So that would be one suggestion that I have. The other thing is that the survey uses the word may. It doesn't say will. And that was also, that was given a lot of thought in the discussion about the survey that we had only just on Thursday. It's not that we had that much time. This has all been moving through, and this material has been presented to council as soon as has been possible. So it's not like we've been hanging on to anything and trying to withhold any information and make any decisions, as Mark said. To one comment that Mark made about being conservative, I wouldn't call it conservative. I would call it aggressively trying to address these infrastructure needs. And I would just also say that there's no culture without infrastructure. And so that didn't quite rhyme the way I thought it would. But in any case, we saw infrastructure as just so critical. And the way that we have been doing things to date, at least in the time that I have been observing this, is we tend to ignore those critical needs in exchange for the shiny baubles. And while the shiny baubles can be very exciting and can bring a lot of vitality to the city, you really can't continue to have a vital city when your streets aren't being taken care of. So that's it. And I guess the other thing I would add is that the survey also will contain a question that asks if there are other projects that they would rather see than the ones that are being suggested in the survey.
Adam, can I add? Can I colloquy?
If you're colloquy,
okay?
please do.
Thank you, because I'm a member of that financial strategy committee as well. And I understand somewhat what Rachel and Bob brought forward, but most of everything that was brought before council today and in the memo came from staff expertise. It's not for me. It's not for Mary or Mark. Yes, there are times we give directions, but it's not as you mentioned, Rachel, whereas we make decisions for the entire council. Even for instance, for the survey, I did not came up with the questions, and I don't think Mary did or Mark did as well. So at the end of the day, these questions are vetted by staff and people with the expertise. So I understand the frustration, but just so you know, most of the work was presented to us as well. We give it some direction and it's brought to you here so that you can make a decision. And I think as well, part of it as well today is that from what I'm hearing in some of the discussions, some things may change and you can change them. So I don't think, I don't necessarily agree that we just make decisions in that committee, just the three of us.
Mirabai.
Thanks, Adam. I'll make mine very quick and simple. Yes, I support number 2. And then just to very quickly colloquy off of what Sam had stated earlier about ALS. We, if I'm not mistaken, are the only city on the Front Range that does not provide advanced life support services to our residents. So keep that in mind, because that's a pretty sad statement in my book.
Thank you, Bob.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact that Mirabai and Sam are advocating for things that are not among the 7 that are surveyed is telling about the fact that council members obviously have interest in things that are not on the survey. It's still a little mystifying to me that we were presented on February 9th at a study session, a list of 44 capital projects. And it's a little puzzling to me why it took from February 9th to May 25th to put the survey together, because that's what we instructed on February 9th, is put together a survey. And it sounds like the committee just got this information on Thursday, which is a little disappointing as well. So I'm just puzzling why it took 3.5 months to pull this together. Now we're kind of in this urgent emergency situation. And, somehow, somewhere along the lines, 44 projects were winnowed down to 7. And we're kind of stuck with that. So I am happy to hear, Mary, that there's going to be an open-ended question for community members to add on whatever project they may have. So it could be one of the 37 that didn't make the cut for the survey from the February 9th memo. It could be ALS. I can't remember if that was on the original list of 44. It could be projects that community members want. We haven't had any public hearing on this. We've had now 2 study sessions, one on February 9th and now one on May 25th. We have no idea what community members may want. And I think presenting them 7, it's like the old Ford adage, right? You can have any color you want as long as it's black. You can have any project as long as it's one of these 7. So I'm happy that we're going to ask an open-ended question. I don't know how community members get access to the information to know what they should even ask for, but maybe there'll be some lobbying during the surveying period, and people can advocate for other projects that are not among the 7. So I guess where we are, I would have liked that this system process to have been different. I would have liked a further discussion on the 44 projects. I would have liked a public hearing because we're now going to receive survey results on July 13th and pretty much have to make a decision on that day without a whole lot of council input. So I've expressed my dissatisfaction twice. I'll shut up about it. But in the future, I think we can do things better.
Thank you, Bob. I still see Mirabai's hand, but I think that's a leftover. I'll weigh in and just say that I'm a yes on 2. And, as per always, if we want a public hearing on anything, we can try to push it through CAC. So if anyone wants to do that, feel free to bring it up. I see Aaron's hand now.
Sorry, were you done, Adam?
I am done.
So just on number 3, I just wanted to say that I am supportive. Do we want to just get a quick show of hands or something? I don't know if that's controversial.
Yeah, I'm gonna do that. I was just about to move on to that. Does anybody have anything to say about debt issuance, or for or against in particular? Mostly against. Last chance. Seeing no hands, everyone appears on board. And we can move on, I believe. Thank you.
Sorry, Adam, to interrupt.
Yeah.
On the question of the polling and the 20%, I thought that was a valuable thing to include. Mark didn't like the idea. Could we maybe do just a straw poll on whether to include that as one of the options in the poll?
Absolutely. So we'll take a quick straw poll here. Just raise your hand physically if you're interested in putting on the 20% as well.
So can I ask a question? Sorry. Aaron, do you mean that you want a 10, 15, and 20% level for, so just to make sure that we know what we're voting on, you're asking that there be 3 different levels, including 20% on the survey that would go towards community projects. Is that right?
That's correct. Thanks for clarifying, Sam.
Yeah. Sorry, Adam, to interrupt.
That's okay. Nope. Want to make sure everyone understood. Okay, we'll take that vote now. Raise your hand if you're interested in adding that 20% option. I see 3, 4, 5. So that will carry it.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
And if anyone has anything else to say about this, we're going to move on to all the other ballot items. It is 8:26, just so you know.
Good to move on. I think, Tom, you're up.
We put up the presentation again, please. Thank you. Next slide, please. So these are the recommendations from the Charter Committee, the Council Charter Committee, which is Council Members Friend, Nagel, and Young. I'm going to present them very briefly. The Recruitment Committee, as Council knows, in Charter Section 9, there's a provision that allows for a Council Recruitment Committee that can meet without having the public involved. There was a discussion this year about creating a public committee. The people who had served on the City Manager Recruitment Committee recommended against that as not practicable. The committee is recommending that the charter language in section 9 be changed from may to shall to provide guidance to future councils. The second committee issue is the authority to appoint committees. The charter implicitly allows council to appoint committees, but it doesn't say council has the authority to appoint committees. It says that they have to meet in public, but there's nothing that says they can create them. So this would be a sort of cleanup that allows for specifically authorizes council to create committees. And there's a recommendation that council limit this, the charter limit the size of the committees. There has been some discussion. There was some discussion on the committee about some committees getting impracticably large. The second recommendation relates to the emergency suspension of charter provisions. As you'll recall, last year, staff suggested that council consider a charter amendment to allow for the emergency suspension of charter provisions during a declared emergency because there are some deadlines in the charter. There are some things that are almost impossible to do still now. This would be helpful. The committee is recommending delaying any further discussion of suspending the charter provisions until after the end of the current emergency, when staff and council has had a time to reflect back on what might be helpful. So certainly not this year. The third area was council compensation. Council knows council is paid $100 adjusted for inflation for every meeting that they attend. This comes various amounts each month. The recommendation is that it be evened out to $100 to even payments 12 months a year, every pay period as city staff are paid. The question for council would be, how does council want to structure this? The charter provision currently says up to 52 meetings. I took a look back in 2017. So how much council members get paid depends on how many meetings there are and how many meetings the council members attend. In 2017, Mary Young attended 61 meetings. Everybody attended over 52, so there was no question. Everybody the maximum. Last year, no one attended 50 because there weren't 50 meetings. So you could just say 52 and leave it at that. In most years, it would be the same as any other years. In a few years, it would be a few $100s more. But it makes it easier. You have to decide what your basis is. In the packet, I drafted language that left it at 52 meetings and just divided that over the year. And then the third recommendation is, as you know, there's been some discussion of council compensation and the inequity that it leaves where people who can't afford to work as hard as you do for free can't run for council. So the thought was to create some sort of blue ribbon commission to study council compensation, look at what other communities do, and make recommendations about perhaps a fair proposal in the future to change the charter. Next slide, please. So I wanted to turn briefly to the initiated ballot measures, because this also could become a council ballot measure issues. There are 3 current active initiated ballot measures. Bedrooms are for people, the Humane Clothing Act, which relates to fur, and let voters decide on the annexation of CU South. Bedrooms are for people has been using the Boulder Direct Democracy online system. The other 2 signatures are gathering signatures on paper. The bedrooms are for people met the required number of endorsements on May 11th. Next slide, please. Just wanted to talk about some relevant deadlines to get these in your head. So the deadline for submission of ballot measures is June 5th. As you know, the charter provides the clerk with 10 days to certify the ballot measures, which she'll do. If there aren't sufficient signatures, that she issues a notice to the committee, and the committee has 10 additional days to collect signatures, and the clerk then has 10 days to review those, which puts the final deadline for clerk certification to June 25th. The last council meeting to approve any ballot measures is August 17th, 2021. The deadline for certification to Boulder County is September 2nd. You may recall last year that the last day for approving ballot measures was September 1st, 2020. Because of the way the meetings work out and the days of the month work out, the council would have to schedule a special meeting if it wants to consider any ballot measures after August 17th. Next slide, please. So this is Charter Section 54. In the past, most recently, I believe, with the Excel ballot measure, council has considered alternative ballot measures when there are ballot measures and policies that council wants to give voters a choice on. What the charter provides that if 2 ballot measures pass, the one with the greater number of votes goes into effect to the extent it conflicts with the other one. When we did the Excel ballot measure, we made clear that it was a conflicting measure. The council measure prevailed and the Excel measure did not. So my ask for council is to consider whether earlier rather than later, whether council wants to consider ballot measures. The quality of the measure really turns on how much time council has to consider it. So the sooner you can get the drafting started, the better it is. So I'm not suggesting that you do this. I just wanted to put this into your heads early, since not everybody on council has ever done this before, and there may be an interest in doing something. Next slide, please. So these are my questions for council. Does council wish to consider the proposed charter amendments to Charter Section 9 relating to council committees? Does council agree that any changes related to emergency suspension of charter provisions be deferred until after the pandemic? Does council wish to consider a charter amendment revising Charter Section 7 to provide for even payment of council members, even payment of council compensation? Does council wish to charge the charter committee with developing a proposal for a blue ribbon commission to study potentially recommended changes to council compensation? If so, does council have any direction regarding membership and scope of such a commission? Does council wish to consider alternative ballot measures for any of the initiated measures? And I'll turn it back to you now, Adam.
Thank you, Tom. So this is a pretty big list. So let's just start with questions, if there are any out there. I see Aaron.
Committee. I understand that that having a quorum of council can be challenging on a committee, because theoretically you could just make decisions right there and then in a subcommittee. So I guess I get why you would want to prohibit that. But why was the number of 2 chosen? Like, what would be so bad about retaining the option to have 3 or 4 council members on the committee.
So Rachel, I believe this was your suggestion. Do you want to respond to Aaron?
I don't remember exactly whose suggestion it was, but I think part of it was responsive to the recruitment subcommittee and needing to get to 2 for in that situation. And then it was, I think, partly just a discussion on the committee about sort of having too many cooks in the kitchen in meetings and wanting to make sure that we, maintained a smaller number of council members so that the majority of discussions were happening at council and not feeling like most council members were getting the information in subcommittee. So I don't remember beyond that why we targeted 2.
Okay, thanks. I'll have a comment in a minute.
Yeah, could I just add to that?
Yep.
So I agree with Rachel. The number of 2 came from the city manager subcommittee feeling, or at least the case where the search committee for the city attorney was going to be 3, and that would have been complicated matters. So that's where that number 2 was derived from. I think that there could be exceptions. One thing that I will add is if people want to join committees that have up to 4 members, I think that's fine. But I think that we have so many committees that to limit it to 2 actually kind of addresses workload in a way, spreads things out in a more even manner. But certainly we could have as many as 4 without reaching the quorum. The quorum was the biggest concern that I had.
Last thing, I think we also maybe talked in the subcommittee about that maybe this hadn't happened much in previous councils, and that it seemed like we were avoiding making hard decisions by picking 2. And so it was easier just to say, well, let's do 3 or 4 if everybody wants to do it. So it might be a bit cleaner and just forcing maybe some of those harder conversations. But then, as Mary said, like it helps with workload and equal distribution of workload and opportunities if we just have the 2 and are consistent and making sure that we have, somebody who's senior and knows what's going on in the committee and somebody who's newer to council, things like that.
In the language that we put in the packet as potential draft language, we use the word generally. It says generally shall be composed of 2, but never shall be more than a quorum. So it's more of guidance than requirement. It's not a prohibition on having a 3-member committee.
Thanks for that clarification, Tom.
May I ask a question? Tom, does it say generally not more than a quorum or should be less than a quorum?
It said it must be less than a quorum, but generally
Okay.
should be 2.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Any other questions? Oh, Aaron?
No, I was just going to give a comment.
Okay, well, let's talk about this first one first then. Any comments on the charter amendments to Charter Section 9 relating to council committees? Aaron?
Yeah, so I'm fine with it as long as it doesn't prohibit a committee of 3 or 4. So that language that you're talking about, Tom, sounds good to me. Prohibit quorums, but only recommend 2 within allowance for more. So if it's in that form, I'm good with it.
Emily, would you mind bringing up slide number 25, please?
And Bob?
Yeah, sorry. I guess I'm inclined not to go out for charter amendments unless it's something that's really super important. And I know that we've had, batches of cleanup. I don't say that this is not really a cleanup thing. I guess I'm not convinced. First of all, I don't think we should have committees with more than a quorum, but I think that could be a council rule. I realize that future councils can violate that rule and create a committee of 5 or 6. But I'm not sure this is something that should go in the charter. I just think that this should be an understanding among council members that committees should generally be 2 and 3. We really shouldn't go beyond 5. I'm not sure that we should tie our hands. And if we're not tying our hands, then I don't know why it's a charter amendment. If we are tying our hands, I don't think we should. So I'm not real thrilled by going out with a charter amendment on this one. I'm not sure what problem we're trying to solve.
Mark?
Yeah, I think I agree with Bob on this one. I'm on a couple of committees where there are more than two: financial strategies with Mary and Junie, intergovernmental affairs. And there's been no problem. I think, where committees require the ability to operate in a confidential manner, at least initially, obviously it's got to be two. But if there's sufficient council interest in a committee so that a third or even a fourth wants to sit in on the meetings and participate in those issues, I'm just not sure I see what the real problem is. The ones that I've been, I'm sorry, go ahead.
My turn. My turn.
Yep, I was moving on.
Great. I disagree with Bob. I think that charter cleanup is important to do. And what I think is important about this one is, as Tom points out, our charter has functioned with us appointing committees, but we don't have the authority by charter. I think we should have the authority to appoint these committees. It becomes really important, of course, when we're doing things like search committees and compensation and evaluation committees. So I think we should go forward with this. I don't have any attachment to saying shall generally consist of no more than two council members. I would like it to say such committees in no event shall be equal or greater than a quorum of council. I think that's useful. So generally, I would like to go ahead with this one if this is the one we're talking about. That's my input.
Rachel, then Bob.
I would just add that I think that council rules don't obviously have the same credibility or legal authority as the charter, but also when you lose institutional knowledge of what we went through with the search committees and really needing to have just two, as well as some questions that we've gotten about, do we have the authority to form, these subcommittees? And I also just resigned from the second subcommittee I was on that was a quorum. So I've been part of two that had 5 or more. So I think that left to our own devices and looking at council rules, which are easily changeable, I can easily see 10 years from now where people won't understand why we made this decision, and we'll go back to having a quorum and then having to figure out again, oops, we probably shouldn't do that. So I agree with Sam. We should clean this up and have it in the charter.
Bob, Mark, Mary.
Sam's comment prompted a question in my mind for Tom. Tom, I thought that we had a provision already in the charter, at least for recruitment committee and maybe also for personnel matters. Aren't those two things, or at least one of those things, contemplated by the charter right now?
Yeah, it's the language on the screen, Bob. It's the stuff that's the old language that you see.
The old language, yeah. So I think we have those things, right?
Yeah, so that's that and the provision on committees meeting in public are the only committees in the charter.
Right. So it's everything else.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mark?
Since the basic premise here, or the issue we're trying to address is prevention of a quorum at a committee, would it make sense to simply leave that language in and take out the language about no more than 2 council members? And then it's simply the will of council as to whether it's going to be 2 or 3 or 4.
Well, I would respond that you don't need to decide that tonight. I've done this a few times, and I'll tell you that what I suggest is almost never what goes on the ballot. Council will work on it over the summer and come up with language. So if I get general direction from council to bring something forward, staff will bring something forward, and council will make it fit council's will.
Okay.
Mary.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, I liked Sam's language on not consisting of a quorum or more. And then that allows for 3 or 4. My biggest concern was the quorum and then allowing a committee of 3 to be on a search committee. So I think that the change in language from may to shall is important.
All right, I see no more hands. Can we take the slide down? I'm going to do a straw poll. It's just going to be a yes or no with the general feedback given by council. So those in favor of moving this forward, raise your hand. I see 7. Mark was an 8-ish. Okay. And Bob, you're opposed?
I was a little unclear on the question. If the question was as proposed, I'm opposed, but if it was as amended, I might be supportive. So I wasn't too sure what the question was.
I think this is going to be amended based on the feedback of the group.
I can get behind it if it was amended the way that Mark and Mary talked about.
Okay. Was anyone against those amendments? Just to make it clear. Doesn't look like it. So as amended, Bob. That would be 9. Okay. Moving on to number 2. That is, does council agree that any changes relating to emergency suspension of charter provisions be deferred until after the pandemic? Anyone want to weigh in? Okay, I see just thumbs, so I'm going to just take a straw poll. So the suggestion was we don't do anything right now. Let's raise our hands if we're on board with that. Everybody, great. Moving on to number 3. Does council wish to consider a charter amendment revising charter section 7 to provide for even payment of council compensation? Anyone would like to speak to this? All right, Mary, would you like to speak?
Yeah, just real quickly. We were going to move forward with this last year. Then the pandemic hit and we dropped it. So we're just revising the work that was done last year. Or reviving, I should say. Reviving and revising, perhaps.
I did have a quick question, Tom. You have it as 52 weeks at $100 per meeting. That seems like it's under what we get, because that would be about $5,200 and we get about double that.
Yeah, it was $100 a meeting back in 1991. It's been adjusted for inflation since then.
Wow. Okay, so that makes sense.
Yeah.
Thanks, inflation. Okay. With that being said, we'll just do a straw poll here. Those in favor of moving it forward, raise your hand. And this is at 52 weeks, just so everybody knows. I see, yep. Junie, are you there too? Okay, 9. Number 4, does council wish to charge the charter committee with developing a proposal for a blue ribbon commission to study and potentially recommend changes to council compensation? Any input? Aaron.
Well, you know, the voters have turned down increased council compensation multiple times over the years. So, you know, I certainly wouldn't want to go straight to the ballot with a compensation increase, but it's an intriguing idea to get a blue ribbon panel to look at it, because then it would be like a third party recommendation. And they might say, everything's great, or they might say, here's a targeted change that we can support for the following reason. And then it isn't just council saying we should give ourselves a raise. So it seems like an interesting idea.
Sam.
So I agree with what Aaron said when the measure before them was to increase our salary by double at that time. It got turned down. But what did pass was giving health benefits to council members, as long as, and I think a key part of this is, as long as the council members who referred that measure to the charter either stood for re-election or left council. So, you know, there's that piece too. But I think seating a commission to look at this would be a great idea, not only because it comes from a third party, but because the equity issues are real. And, you know, we've never had the bandwidth to really kind of do a survey of what other councils have done around this and cities of our size and so on. So I think maybe one of the reasons that we haven't gotten support the 2 times in the past that it's failed have been that the homework hasn't really been done and it hasn't come from a third party. So I think this might be a way to to let the community have input in the formation of the proposal as well. So I support it.
Bob.
Two things. I assume that this Blue Ribbon Commission would work over the next several months, and we're talking about a potential ballot measure in 2022. Is that right?
Yeah, I wasn't suggesting anything this year.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. And I just like to make. I'm in favor of having a commission. It doesn't hurt. We'll learn something from that, and we'll decide what to do with it. I'd like to suggest, if we do form a commission, that the committee that puts that commission together consider as members former council members, for two reasons. Number one, few people know the level of effort better than they, and second, they're unlikely to run for council again, and so they would not be benefiting themselves. They would look at this objectively from their experience. And so it doesn't have to be all former council members, but I think a few former council members would be of value to the commission.
Any others? Otherwise, I'm going to weigh in. Yeah, I certainly remember not voting for this because I didn't see very many people that looked like me or like Mirabai or like Junie on council, and I didn't feel it was very deserving. But now that I've been on the other side of the fence, I can say it's necessary. And if we actually want diversity of opinion and a constant diversity of opinion, it's going to be a requirement. So I'm definitely in favor. That being said, let's do a straw poll. Those all in favor of moving it forward? All right, Blue Ribbon Commission it is. 5, if so, does council have any direction regarding membership and scope? Bob already answered that. Any additional input there from anybody else? I like his ideas personally. Mary?
Yes, I like Bob's ideas, suggestions. I would also add that we consider also having people that have considered running but didn't because they knew what the workload was. Yeah.
I have Aaron and Sam.
Yeah, it's a great idea, Bob, about having former council members involved. I just think there should also be some other community members as well, just to make that point. Thanks.
And Sam?
I agree with Bob and Aaron. There should be council members. They should be a small minority of whatever group is put together. So, and agree with Mary that people who have decided not to run. I think another part of the scope might be to look holistically at compensation, not just salary and not just health, but if there are other benefits that could be given that would entice people. So specifically, what are the gaps that someone who's low income would face? Of course, money is the first and primary, but are there other benefits that could be given that would help offset some of those gaps?
Thank you all, and I totally agree. Former council being a small part of that, and definitely having a diversity of opinions, income ranges, all of that. So we get a good selection of people who would put something forward that most people would actually agree on. Rachel?
Yeah, I agree with all of that and look forward to having this commission seated. So appreciate the feedback and also just wonder, I think, there's the old saying, like, how much, what for how much money. And so I think that's part of what we're looking at, but part of that is how much time for how much money. And I don't know if we need to be perhaps tracking time to help that commission understand what it is that they're compensating. So, the attorneys here are going to be like, I will not write down like billable hours ever again. So I also don't want to do it, but I do think it might be helpful for that, whoever's looking at it, to know what are the hours we're putting into this. So it might be helpful if we started, Tom's laughing too, it's awful. It might be helpful if we did some tracking.
Sam? Yep.
Given that there will be a direct mayoral election in 2023, I think the committee should look at the mayor compensation as well as the council compensation to see if there's any difference. I don't know if there would be or not, but it will be a different world when the mayor's directly elected. I don't know if that'll have any impact. I just wanted to put that out there.
All right, any further input? Otherwise, we're going to move on. Great. Last one. Does council wish to consider alternative ballot measures for any of the initiated measures? Thoughts? Seeing none, that's a very easy one. Tom, we don't have any yet. Oh, Aaron?
Oh, just I would not recommend that we do that at this point. I don't have any that I would think of doing. They're all citizen initiatives, and hearing from the voice of the people would be good to know.
Great. Okay, I think that wraps up this item.
Adam, there's one more question on the next slide. Is there any other ballot measure council wants staff to start working on? Anything that's on your minds yet?
Seeing none.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Tom. I think you're the next item as well.
I am. This will be a brief presentation on online petitioning, and if I could get authorization to share my screen, I'll put it up. One second. So you should be seeing the online petitioning screen.
Yep.
All right, so Boulder Direct Democracy Online. So we're calling our online petitioning system. It was implemented in January of 2021. The first petition went live on February 8th, 2021. A petition needs endorsements equal to 10% of the number of voters at the last 2 municipal elections. That number for this year is 3,336. Bedrooms are for people met this standard on May 11th, 2021. That's 92 days. They're still collecting endorsements. As I said earlier, the petition is active until June 5th, 2021. While the Bedrooms for People initiative appears to be successful, there were some challenges that I kind of wanted to talk to you a little bit about. Perhaps our biggest challenge was security. The system uses multi-factor authentication. The challenge was finding something that only the voter would have, would be, know, or have. As a city, we do not have direct access to voter registration information. That data is only available to the state and the counties. We developed an MOU last summer with the county. The city receives information that is available to any member of the public, which means that we can't just take a field out of there and use it as for verification, because everything that we get is also something that anybody in the public could get if they pay for it. So we decided to use telephone number as a way of conveying something to a voter who would only have that information, that is the telephone number and the code that we sent them. Telephone number is an optional field in voter registration, so a voter is not required to provide it when registering. A large number of voters don't have a telephone number in their voter registration records. A voter can easily add a number, but it takes 24 to 72 hours to get into the Boulder Direct Democracy Online. After we went live, we discovered that for a period of about 10 years, the voter could check a box to make a voter's number unlisted. The state prohibits the county from providing unlisted numbers to the public. So even if a person has a telephone number in their voter registration record, the file that the city receives will not include that number if the voter's number is unlisted. There's no difference from the city's perspective between the records where voter has no telephone number and one where the telephone number is unlisted. We just get a blank field. Thus, we had situations where a voter checked the voter registration database, saw a number or added a number, yet still received a message from us that there was no number in there. The county requires a signature from a voter to change the number from listed to unlisted. Originally, the county was requiring voters to come in and sign a form in person. Because of the pandemic, they subsequently agreed to accept a scanned and emailed signature. This still presented a barrier to voters. Another challenge was the fact that we're doing verification up front. As you know, with paper petitions, many signatures are invalidated. The voter never sees this. With BDDO, the voter never gets to endorse at all. One person called and spoke with Diane and said that he had been signing petitions for years, but our system would not allow him to do so. The clerk's office checked and he did not live in Boulder, and he had been signing petitions for years, but his signature had never counted. Also, the Secretary of State updates voter registration if someone changes their driver's license when they move. So people think that they're still registered in Boulder when in fact they're no longer registered there. I mentioned that security was a challenge. I want to show you this chart. This was as of May 11th. As you can see, 73% of the attempts to enter our system were automated attempts from a bot running on a system at Google. So only 27% of the users of our system were real individuals. This is as of May 11th. The number of automated attempts has continued to go up. It used to be a peak that we saw every couple of days. Now we're seeing a steady stream of automated attempts. They're running the script all the time. So it's a challenge. As far as we know, we don't believe any of those were successful because obviously they can't get a code through a telephone number. Now, looking at the actual individual access, we saw that 75% of the people did not receive the no telephone number message, either because they already had a telephone number or the Bedrooms for People committee advised them to put a telephone in before they tried to endorse. Of the rest, 462 or 14% received that message and ultimately successfully endorsed. Unfortunately, there were 373 people who received that message and never were able to complete the process. There were 2 people who came back, successfully completed the process, but did not endorse. Now, I should remind you that these numbers are as of May 11th. Some of those 373 people, or the 375 people, could have subsequently come in and endorsed after that date. Bedrooms for People still is active, and people will be able to endorse until the midnight on June 4th. As you can see, the system is not perfect. I wish it worked better. We don't live in a perfect world, though. We don't have the data to really do good multi-factor authentication other than through the phone number. The phone number has challenges that we didn't even know about when we started this. The world we live in also is not perfect. There are bad people out there who are trying to do things on the internet. And one thing that I'm fairly certain of, and once the clerk finishes their verification process of the endorsements, we'll be able to say for sure, but we don't believe any of these are fraudulent. We believe all of the endorsements they got were real and good, and that the clerk will ultimately certify it. That's my presentation. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Rachel.
I'm just wondering, are we doing anything proactive to make that unlisted phone number situation better for future years? Because I did not have an unlisted phone number, but I got entered by some clerk as unlisted, and it took a number of steps to figure out and phone calls that was the situation. So it is a real barrier. I really wanted to get through this and trial the system and get to signing. So I was very motivated. So for somebody who's somewhat motivated and maybe supports a cause, but not that motivated, it's tricky. So is there any chance that is going to improve through county changes or anything we can do?
We met with the county clerk and recorder. Their system requires that they have a real signature because the law is that the last signature you got is the authentic signature that you use on your voter record. So they want a real signature to change it. We weren't able to make any progress with getting, they didn't think we should be using phone number at all, but they didn't have a suggestion about what we could use. So email address is a possibility, but email address is also a optional field. It's not a public field, so we can't get it.
So in my situation, let's say I tried to sign it on April 1st and entered a phone number. Then on April 1st, when I tried to sign it, that's when the clerk added me as an unlisted phone number, even though I had not asked to be unlisted. So they were doing something on the clerk's end that auto unlisted phone numbers. So there was no signature saying I was unlisted. And so then you don't even know that you're unlisted because the system doesn't tell you, it just says you can't sign. So it really just seems like there should be some way to at least know that the system thinks you're unlisted as of 2 days ago or whatever. And then you should be able to make a quick call and say somebody checked the wrong box. But it seems like they were maybe checking all these new people as unlisted.
That's the first time I've heard that. I thought the unlisted was only, and what they told us was something from the past. I'm sorry that you.
So I saw that in your memo that it was something like 2010. I didn't even register to vote until years after that. So they listed me as unlisted this year, at the time I was trying to sign. So there is there are glitches to it that I think are serious and probably avoidable, but should be, if they could at least just tell the signer, you're unlisted. You need to take these steps, but they don't tell you that. It's really difficult.
As we said in the memo, our team is going to sit down when this is over, talk to stakeholders, and once we get past the election, and look at improvements that we can make. We do face this challenge in that we're a city, and in Colorado, the state and the counties have the data, and the county worked with us in the middle of a pandemic that we negotiated an MOU to get the data feed that we get. So we appreciate their help. But there are constraints that just arise from the nature of us being a city and not a county.
All right, Aaron, and then Sam.
Yeah, so that's good to hear, Tom, because I was just going to ask the same thing to see if we could sit down with the county, in a couple months after this is all over for the year, and say what worked, what didn't work, what possible improvements could we put together jointly that could make issues like with the unlisted phone number work better. So I'm glad to hear that, and I don't know, I'm certainly happy to participate in that if the council is okay with that, or if somebody else wants to join or whatever. But I'm happy to talk about that. And so the good news is that the system is functional, right? And to the point that an initiative was actually able to be successful. But I do know that they ended up spending dozens of hours of professional IT time building a system on top of the system in order to make it work. And I think probably if you had a citizen initiative that did not have IT professionals involved, it would have been a lot harder to pull that off. So hopefully we can keep working on the ease of use and the city-county collaboration issues so that, it's smoother in the future. And then I assume next year we can revisit the possibility of doing a combined paper and online petition, because I think that's worth considering for the next time around, now that we've had a year behind us. That's all. Thanks.
Sam?
I just want to say thank you to everyone who is involved in making this work, not only Tom and our staff, but the county clerk and the Secretary of State and the petitioners who ran the first petition through it. There have been a lot of talk about voting systems this year for good reason. And we went ahead and added a direct democracy function, which contrary to what some people who write us say, has not been done in this country before. There's one other system that does candidate endorsements that collects a lot fewer signatures and has a lot less authentication. So this is a big deal to have gotten through it. And, kind of like with the mayor thing and the ranked choice voting, it's not like the people who are running the county and the state systems are clamoring for us to do those things. There are activists who are clamoring for it, and we are among those activists as a city, but change does take time. So I think this was a very successful first year, and I want to thank the petitioners for bedrooms for having helped us work out some of the bugs, because some of these unforeseen things were unforeseen. They were unforeseen by the clerk and the Secretary of State, as well as our staff. So anyway, I think we should be proud of getting this done. It is not perfect, as Tom said, but it's pretty darn good for a first-time system in the country rolled out during a pandemic. So anyway, thank you, Tom, and thanks to all the staff for this, and thanks to Molly Fitzpatrick for helping us out with that, and to Secretary of State as well. Anyway, and I appreciate the update, Tom, and I look forward to the debrief. And if we can do online and physical signatures, great, but at least we have this, even if it's a lot of work to do combined.
Anyone else? Thank you for that update, Tom. Anyone have any other business? All right, seeing none, we're gonna adjourn here at 9:09, and it's dark.
Adam.
Sorry, Bob.
Nice job, Adam.
Yeah,
thank you,
Adam. Good meeting.
See y'all soon.
Good stuff, Adam. Way to go.